Are we ready? Okay, got all the technology in place. Certainly want to welcome everybody. We're glad to hear this extremely important meeting of the Education Preparation and License Subcommittee. Now, who all do we have on? What board members do we have on the line? Bill, are you on?
I'm on. Good morning.
Great, Bill. Welcome. Any other board members on?
Yes, I'm here. This is Lillian
Okay,
Hartgrove.
welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Any other board members? Okay, and Mike and I are here, so we got Mike and myself and Bill and Lillian as the board members. I don't know that we need to call the roll with that, so we know what board members are here, and certainly Sarah and Candace, glad to have you with us, so forth. We've got I think a really important agenda for today, and it's a long agenda. I hope that we can get through all of this and still get finished by somewhere around 12:30 or so. This is an extremely important subject. You know, the thing that I'm so excited about with this subject is that, this is a concern the state board has had for, I was going to say 20 years. That may be an overstatement, but I don't think it is. But the thing I'm excited about is I think we're finally taking some action. We're finally getting some traction, getting some interest, and making some things happen in this area that probably needed to happen a long time ago. But I think we're got a good opportunity to make them happen now. We had the first subcommittee meeting. I think we got good results for that. Laura prepared a summary of that meeting, which I think was effective, and we took some action as a result of that meeting at our last board meeting. So again, making some progress. The subcommittee deliverables and timeline, this is in your package here. This is, I guess we've put this together kind of at the start of this process and have updated a little bit, but I think it's important to keep this in front of us. The subjects that we've got identified here are extremely important components of this overall area, and the timeline that we've laid out there, I think, is pretty aggressive, but hopefully we can stay with it. Sarah, you want to talk some more about that document and so forth, kind of where you see it and where you see us going?
Sure, and just in brief, it's really, in terms of the agenda item on this topic, it's helpful to have, I think, a guiding document around the key areas of exploration and the questions that we were posing as a subcommittee at the start of this process. But I think also it's important to kind of pause at this point in the process and see if there are any other deliverables or topics that the subcommittee wants to explore in addition to the ones that are listed. So and most of you have this in front of you, but we're looking at our current content assessments and ensuring that the current content assessments that we have are appropriate and that the cut scores that we have are telling us something meaningful about content mastery for our licensure candidates. We're also looking ahead towards future content assessments and trying to acknowledge, and we'll talk about this at much greater length later in the meeting, the extent to which we can find content assessments that really serve our needs as a state in terms of the role that they play in determining licensure qualifications. We're also exploring a performance assessment requirement, and that was one of the actions that the board took at the last meeting that the chairman mentioned, and we'll talk much more about that today as well. And then we're going to be exploring, again, the program admissions process and the program approval process. Those are two key parts of the policy that was passed in fall of 2014. I know Amy's prepared to talk a lot more about that today in terms of the comprehensive reviews, the interim reviews, and these annual reports, some new and important kind of steps forward in terms of how we think about program approval. And on the back, you have a little bit more detail in terms of the timing that we have laid out to attempt to take on these topics. But I'll stop there and just, I think, again, any board members or others joining the discussion, if there are other topics that have come to light through some of the other conversations, certainly SCORE has been involved, and the SCORE Institute on Teacher Preparation, I think, was a really important and good convening on this topic, and there's been a number of other conversations across the state happening around teacher preparation. So if there's anything we're missing, I think this is a good time to sort of surface and begin to add that into our work.
Anything we've missed? Any area?
This is one of those questions that I have no thoughts, ideas, and then going home about Cookville one will occur to me. So that's just the world I live in.
Yep. Okay, well, we will look forward to your, email from Cookville.
Epiphany.
Yeah, right.
Cookville
I will
epiphany.
say, Mike, just in some conversations we've had, if this primes your memory, you'd mentioned the diversity of the teaching population. I didn't know if that was something, that was a big topic at the SCORE Institute, and I know it's part of the way we're thinking about the recruitment goals as part of the program approval and program partnership with districts. I don't know if that's something that the subcommittee wants to include, but that was the one thing that I had mentioned to me sort of in one-on-one conversations.
Well, we do. Where I don't, all right, so we really do need to include that. Districts are required to have a plan. So who are we trying to set a policy for? The districts on their hiring practice or the teacher prep programs who, if the supply is not there, it's kind of hard to hold districts responsible for hiring that's not there. So I think it's a we're going to have to look at it at a number of levels, but we have got to have teachers in Tennessee that mirror the students in Tennessee. It's just not, that's not a negotiable. If we're going to be successful, that's got to happen. And because it's hard doesn't mean we don't come up with ways to figure it out.
I think that's a good point. We've talked, some about this, and I think it is important that we add this because it is a important dimension. As Mike says, it's not going to be the easiest thing to do, but obviously where we are at the present time is not acceptable. We need to make some progress on moving in the direction we need to be in.
One suggestion might be if it is a topic that we want to explore further as a subcommittee, we can put it on sort of as an exploratory topic. And then I do think when Amy talks about the program approval process and the comprehensive reviews and some of the partnership work that will be happening, I think that might be a place to sort of come back to this topic in terms of how we think about incentivizing both the programs and districts to think about the recruitment of teachers that do better match their student population. That might be a way to think about it as opposed to putting any kind of stakes around it yet. Let's explore it. Let's figure out how we can help our programs and our districts to prioritize that in terms of their recruitment goals.
There are strategies all over the country that have worked, different strategies, different places, but they're pretty good ideas that have a track record are in place now. It's just a matter of taking a look at them, but there's some pretty good things that.
Okay. Add that to. Okay. Anything else? Any other items to add or questions or modifications? Okay, we'll move to a discussion on EDTPA. Got a panel discussion coming up. Laura, are you going to?
I'm going to kick us off and kind of facilitate throughout. But first, before we jump into the panel piece, and we've got both Andrea Whitaker, who's joining us by phone, who's going to be giving us some national context, as well as two individuals from Tennessee EPPs who are going to provide a bit of their experience and context from implementing in Tennessee. But before we do that, I wanted to turn it over to Amy, who's just going to review a couple of slides that we talked about last time, just to refresh everyone's memory about what EdTPA is and what it does.
You will likely remember these slides. They're the same slides that we shared at our last subcommittee meeting, but just to get our minds back into this work, wanted to take a minute and talk about the value of performance assessment. I know you mentioned that the state has been talking for quite a while about making some changes to our assessment structure for teacher candidates, and one of the most significant shifts that we've been considering is moving from our current Principles of Learning and Teaching assessment, which is a multiple choice exam in the Praxis series that measures teaching pedagogy, to a performance assessment. And we think that there is a lot of value in a performance assessment. Here you see that we find that performance assessments offer authentic, competency-based practical experiences. They focus on both pedagogy and pedagogical content knowledge. And in addition, they're good preparation for the evaluation that teachers are likely going to face once they actually enter Tennessee classrooms. As Laura's mentioned, and as you're aware, at the last board meeting, there was the first reading to accept the EdTPA as our new performance assessment. It has been allowed in Tennessee for quite a while, but not required. The EdTPA, and I won't spend much time talking about this because I think Andrea is going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the EdTPA in particular, but it is a nationally available assessment. It's focused on student learning, and it's designed to be educative, and I think that's one of the more valuable parts of this type of assessment, is that it helps the candidate learn about their own practice, but it also is valuable for our preparation programs because they can see how their candidates are doing on certain aspects of their learning. I know that Andrea is also going to talk about where EdTPA is available, so I'll skip that slide. As I mentioned, since 2012, we have allowed the use of EdTPA, and 8 of our institutions have already implemented the use of EdTPA. And as Laura said, we've got 2 of our faculty who here today who are going to talk about the implementation of EdTPA on their campuses and what that has been like. And then just briefly, we'll talk more in depth later about cut scores, but there is a nationally recommended cut score of 42, and we have some colleagues from Pearson here as well today, but I think it's important to point out that I don't believe there's any state currently utilizing the 42 as a requirement. I think there's 1 or 2 states using 41, 3 using 41, and what we've recommended right now is sort of a gradual increase on the EdTPA that would expect a 37 now, and then when the requirement goes into place on January 1st, 2019, we would move that requirement to 42, at which time, unless another state moves their cut score up, we would be requiring the highest score in the country. The EdTPA covers almost all of our subject areas. It's organized into 3 tasks. Again, I won't spend much time here because I think that Andrea will talk in more detail about this. The tasks are assessed using a rubric, and the expectation is that a candidate perform at the level 3 on the rubric. Scoring of EdTPA, I think this is another advantage of the EdTPA. We do have some providers in Tennessee that use their own performance-based assessments, and we aren't questioning whether those are high quality or not, but what they can't offer us is the ability to consider the data across providers if we do that. So by accepting the EdTPA, then all of our providers are using the same assessment, and those assessments are externally scored by reviewers who are trained to score the EdTPA. And as I shared with you last time, our initial data give us indication that there is some relationship between performance on the EdTPA and subsequent performance in the classroom. We see the most difference when looking between someone who scores a 37 or better and a below 37, but we do see that that relationship continues to get stronger as the score increases.
Me on that one, how about, I'm still having trouble understanding that chart. I looked at it a couple times and I thought I understood it, but when I come back, I lose track of it.
Sure.
What?
So the bars are broken into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that is the overall evaluation rating.
That's the overall.
That's the overall. So you can see it for those educators who scored below a 37. Only 5.7% received an overall evaluation score of level 5, whereas for educators who received a 41 or higher, 13% were at a level 5. More teachers who scored higher on the EdTPA ended up with a higher overall evaluation rating.
Okay. I got it now.
Okay,
Evaluation rating once they're hired and in the
Yeah,
classroom.
That's
that-
correct.
That's
Exactly.
what I
that
was
is
missing.
that is correct.
Yeah, I was.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. I'm sorry. This is their when they've become a teacher of record in a Tennessee public school, and they're being assessed on TEAM or Tiger or TEM, one of those.
We've got a significant population
You know,
in those numbers.
it's still small, and so I wouldn't want to overstate the relationship yet. I think that's something that will consider to monitor closely in the coming years. And that's another reason that it's good that we, will have a few years before it's a mandated score, because we'll be able to continue to look at the relationship between the scores and then performance in the classroom and make sure that we feel like we're comfortable with the scores that we've set. I think I've mentioned all of these before, but we do think that there are a lot of benefits to adopting the performance assessment. It'll be common across all of our educators. It's well aligned with TEAM, which are what are the expectations that our teachers will face as when they enter our classrooms. It assesses both pedagogy and pedagogical content knowledge, and we talk a lot about our content exams, and this is another really important signal about an educator's readiness to enter the classroom, is whether they know how to teach that content. And then lastly, it is externally scored, so we know that those reviewers are trained and monitored and well prepared to make an assessment of the candidate's readiness. In terms of challenges, these are the same challenges that we've been talking about. A timeline for implementation, and I think that our faculty who are here today can share with you their experiences about implementing the EdTPA and what it requires on a campus in order to implement it well. And it also requires significant time for our candidates to actually do this work. It's not a 3 hours, take an exam and walk away. It is an ongoing endeavor and requires a lot of their time and attention. There is also a cost factor to it that we should be cognizant of. It is an increased cost over the PLT. And then finally, we will need to think about how the state will support faculty becoming trained. So while we have 8 providers that have implemented EdTPA, that leaves over 30 that haven't implemented the EdTPA who would need support and training in order to begin to support their educators in preparing for this exam or this assessment.
I don't, this thing's gonna get answered later, but when does the performance assessment occur?
So I would want our faculty to talk about that with you, hopefully when they're on the panel today. But generally, I believe that it takes place in the last semester of the senior year or the last semester of the preparation program. And that is a challenge because if someone doesn't meet the benchmark, we have to know how and when they would be able to be remediated. The performance assessment requires that you have access to a classroom. And so if you don't, and I would really like to hear from our faculty about their experiences with that and what challenges that has presented.
The only point I wanted to make is only the challenge of it requires significant time for candidates to complete. These candidates are paying tuition to become competent in a profession. That's part of it. So it would be more like they ought to be upset if they're not getting competently skilled.
I think that's a fair statement. I think what I've heard from faculty, and it depends on who you talk with, which providers, that in some places there has been instances where they give their student teachers a week off of student teaching to actually do all the writing that's required for EdTPA, whereas other campuses don't treat it that way, and they felt that they've elevated the time required, and they get concerned about students who have to work while they're also student teaching, while they're doing Ed TPA. So it's not that it's about the rigor that anyone's questioning, but that just the practical reality of the additional time that it is taking to complete the performance assessment.
That would make it unique, being treated unique to other professional schools who want to get the skill and whatever other issues you got, deal with them.
Okay. Questions? I mean, one question I had, is there good alignment between the various assessments that are available through EdTPA and our certifications or our credentials?
How to get back to that. So I might ask Andrea to speak to that a little bit. It would be my understanding, and here I'm getting a little bit out of my depth, but that they would be utilizing Tennessee student standards. They would be teaching to the Tennessee student standards when they would be doing their performance of tasks, when they would be designing their lessons, when they would be conducting their instruction, and when they would be designing their assessments and analyzing those. And so that would, in fact, make it well aligned with the content expectations that we would have for our candidates. But again, I think that I would let Andrea speak to that and our faculty speak to that very specific question. I think it's an important one to ask.
And just maybe a finer point on it. I mean, in terms of the endorsements that we currently offer, will we have to change our structure as a state in terms of?
No.
Okay, they
No.
would sort of mirror closely enough what we
Yes.
currently offer.
Yes.
Okay, so I got one thing I would like to talk about, the possibility of adding to our,
You didn't even have to get to Crossville.
mentally, my ED started me down the road. All right, so the classroom experience is clearly a big deal, not only on this, but really post-graduation. We have two licenses, the practitioner is it, and then the professional. What has to happen to transition from one to the other, I think we ought to look at and make sure that that period of time, even if it may be shortened, or I don't know, but is one, like, I hate to use it, but like a residency in medical school, to where you have to really demonstrate that you can do that. Which means, in my mind, not only does the district need to be involved in that, but the college needs to remain involved in that. Otherwise, it's hard for them to look and see what's happening post-graduation. But I really think we ought to pay attention to what the functional difference in a practitioner and a professional license is.
I think we would welcome the opportunity to talk about that more deeply. I know that we've been, at the department, we've been talking about ideas related directly to that work. And I would say that our work to highlight and elevate expectations related to partnerships between districts and educator preparation providers is a really good space for us to work on that kind of thing. But I think there are also a lot of other things to do related to that.
For the record, Mike, I want to make sure I have this. You want to add to the list to look at the advancement bar between the practitioner and the professional license?
Yes, and who should be involved.
Okay, and who's involved?
Okay. Very good.
All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and dive into kind of our two-part panel here. So first, I want to introduce Andrea Whitaker. She is the Director of Teacher Performance Assessment at the Scale Center, which is the Stanford Center for Assessment, Learning, and Equity, the entity that helped develop and is also helping to implement the EdTPA across the country. So with that, Andrea, I will turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. And I can see you all in the room, and I've noticed there's been a little bit of a time delay between the visual and the sound, and so I'll do my best to move things along without it being too awkward. So please let me know if you need me to change my volume or if the sound quality isn't working for you. So thank you very much for inviting me today. I am very pleased to provide some national context for EdTPA and then turn things over to the panel members, to Renee and Julie, who will definitely be able to speak to the educative uses of EdTPA through their experiences implementing EdTPA in Tennessee. So if you could move the slides, please, Laura, and just advance to the slide with the apple on it. And I'll begin there. So EdTPA was developed by Scale in partnership with the profession. And we developed Scale as a support and assessment system. It is not intended to be merely a traditional licensure test, but it is intended to be an opportunity for inquiry and support for both candidates and programs to examine actionable evidence that improves the practice of both. And just to take a step back, EdTPA stands on the shoulders of other performance-based assessments of teaching, going back to the National Board. Linda Darling-Hammond and Ray Pashone, who have been integral into for the development of EdTPA, were involved in the original design of the National Board, and then the INTASC portfolio, the Performance Assessment for California Teachers, and now EdTPA available at a national level. So we did work very closely with teachers and teacher educators from around the country to develop EdTPA through a series of pilots and field testing from 2009 to 2014 when it became operational. And Tennessee was at the table from the very beginning. And I just want to make one shout out early on in the process when other states were moving forward with policy. A member of your Tennessee team said to us, well, in Tennessee, policy follows practice. And I think that was a very wise way of thinking about engagement with EdTPA, and the 8 campuses that have been involved to date have been very engaged and have been influential, I will say, in the design of the support aspects of EdTPA for others around the country. So I just wanted to offer my gratitude for that level of engagement these past 5 years. Actually, now 6 or 7 years. So the gentleman asked a question about EdTPA. Would you advance the slide, please? About a 2-tiered licensure system. And we do think of EdTPA in a continuum of professional practice. It's kind of an anchor, if you will, for the development of teachers over time. And it is intended to be an assessment of readiness to teach or readiness for initial licensure. But it fits in this trajectory of induction, which would come next, often supported by school districts in partnership with the EPP community. And then ultimately, teacher leadership and accomplished teaching, which might be measured by the National Board. Next slide, please. EdTPA is also, I don't know if my screen is stuck. I'm still seeing the slide with the apple. Was everybody able to see the
There's a slight
continuum?
time delay, Andrew, you're right, but we're seeing the
okay.
capstone slide.
Okay, great. Yeah, there is a bit of a delay. So EdTPA is intended to be part of a multiple measures assessment system. It isn't the be-all, end-all only measure to determine readiness for licensure. Historically, states have basic skills and subject matter knowledge exams as a set of requirements. There are expectations for clinical supervision, observations and feedback that are done at the local level by the EPP in partnership with the P12 community. And there are courses, coursework, GPA requirements, embedded teacher assignments, other kinds of assessments embedded in that program that all make up a multiple measures assessment system. EdTPA is intended to be a capstone, and the question about when does it occur, it does occur within a clinical experience. And the comments about how much time it takes, I know you'll hear from Julie and Renee about how much of an investment it's been for their programs, but it is intended to be embedded in the clinical practice and draws upon the authentic artifacts of that classroom teacher's work. There are some writing requirements that they do have to defend and justify and describe and analyze sources of evidence, and that does take time. But it doesn't necessarily require additional time in a classroom because it's embedded in their clinical experience. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. We've been throwing around the word educative. Amy used it in her opening comments, and you'll definitely hear that from Julie and Renee. But our intention was for EdTPA to be educative, that it would support and promote candidate learning in a formative way as they're getting ready to do EdTPA, and that they would learn in the process of doing EdTPA. That EdTPA's evidence and the candidate experience can inform a professional development plan that can be used for goal setting in that induction period or in that second opportunity to develop their practice that we were talking about a moment ago. The evidence from EdTPA and the experience of implementing it provides information that programs can use to improve what they do. There are also research opportunities for faculty to use some EdTPA data or the process that they're engaged in and their candidate experience to get publications and to inform our ongoing work in a research agenda for EdTPA and also to inform policy. So in the next slide, we just have a short list of the various resources that EdTPA provides in support of educative implementation. I do want to mention again the professional growth plan, which we just released last year, which is very useful in helping candidates as they exit programs do goal setting for induction. And we have about a total of over 150 resources are now available in the online community for programs using EdTPA, and those resources have been downloaded now over 600,000 times. So it's a big community. Many faculty around the country are engaged, and we view our role at scale as very important to not only supporting initial implementation as people are getting started, but also in sustaining the use of the assessment. So Amy talked a little bit in one of her slides that there are 3 tasks. We view, if you could go to the next slide, please. We view EdTPA as a cycle of effective teaching. It's a way for candidates to be focused on student learning, to leverage what they know about their students and what they bring as assets, as well as prior academic learning, to plan for student learning based on what they know about their students and the local or state or national content standards for student learning, that they plan those lessons, they teach those lessons and engage students in ways that deepen subject matter knowledge, and then they assess what students have learned. So we think of planning as the intended teaching, instruction as the enacted teaching, and assessment as the impact of their teaching on student learning. And framing all 3 tasks is an emphasis on analyzing teaching or justifying practice, as well as an examination of academic language, or how language is used in the classroom to support content learning. So the next slide, please. This is our map, and I know in the previous meeting you had a little bit more information about the spread of EdTPA. There are now 16 states with EdTPA-related policy. Those states are shown in red. There are 2 states with pending policy that actually are listed in those 16. The tan states are states where there is at least one educator preparation program engaged in EdTPA, and in most cases, it's a lot more than one. North Carolina, for example, doesn't have any policy at this time, but has very widespread use of EdTPA in the UNC system. So you can tell by the states shown in white that there are very few states where there's no EdTPA involvement at all. In the next slide, I have a listing of the performance standards. Amy mentioned that the nationally recommended professional performance standard was 42. That was a process where we had several panels that looked at TPA performance from the field test years, looked at impact data, looked at actual portfolios, and came to the number 42 as an aggregate score across 15 rubrics on that 5-level scale. And Amy did call out that the level 3 on that scale is sort of an anchor for readiness to teach for a beginner. But I also want to call out that the scale has 5 levels, and that the levels 4 and 5 represent a more advanced or deeper understanding or more sophisticated practice for a beginning teacher. So you can see in this list that California, Iowa, and New York all have a professional passing standard of 41. Several states use a score of 38 or 37, as with Tennessee's decision for the TBR campuses. And then Georgia, Illinois, and Washington all started at the number 35 with a plan to increase that number over time as they have more data and so on. And the pass rates do vary by state and by cut score. The states that have had the lower score tend to have pass rates in the 90s, 90% or so, or more, and the other states where it's slightly higher, it runs between 75 and 85% pass rate. So, and we can get you, or Nathan Estel, who I know is in the room today, can get more information to you about pass rates at various numbers as you go forward. So here is just a quick summary of the national performance across the last few years. And I haven't shown the average score by rubric, but it's basically hovering around the 3. But these are task-based aggregate scores and an overall mean for large numbers of candidates from 2014, 2015, and then overlapping the most recent academic year of 2015-16. So you can see there are very large numbers of candidates who are taking NTPA. The scores are turned around in 3 weeks, and there is time built into the system generally, or some sort of a contingency plan for candidates who aren't successful the first time for their program to support them for a retake. And I think Nathan on another date I can provide much more information about what that process is and what different state policies have been in that regard. So I think with that, I'm done. I'd love to hand things over to Julie and Renee to talk much more about their actual implementation. And I can stay on the line for about another 40 minutes to answer any remaining questions. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you, Andrea. Want to go to the Renee and Julie now?
So Renee and Julie, if you guys want to join us up here, that'd be great.
And while they're approaching, if there are questions I can answer, I'm still here. I can do so.
Mr. Chairman?
Andrea?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Bill?
Could you just give us a picture of what the percentage of our teacher candidates that are currently taking EdTPA? I know I think it was stated we have 8 providers who are utilizing it, 30 or not, but give us just a little extra picture of the extent of usage right now.
I don't have that number on my fingertips. I would say that it is a large percentage because most of our large campuses are members of TBR, but I don't have the percentage at my fingertips. Nathan, I feel like we've talked about it before, and he probably has some numbers that he can. It's going to take him a minute, he said, but we'll come back.
Now, is it for the TBR campuses, all candidates are going through this, or is that?
That's been my understanding, but I think that there has been some variation on some campuses where maybe some groups like special education programs weren't implementing EdTPA always. I could be mistaken about that, but I know that I feel like I've heard that.
Part of the timeline, because we did have a significant amount of time to implement.
You think now everybody
I think
is?
now they are initial licensure programs, and so that's one difference. We haven't had very many of our library science because most of our library science candidates are not initial license, and so we may have just had one or two of those. So that would be a change for us.
And so the PLT would not have been repeated? Principles of Learning and Teaching would be done with your initial license, and you wouldn't redo that for your advanced. And so that's why they wouldn't do the TPA as a part of an advanced program.
Hey, Mike?
Andrea, as how diverse can this program be implemented and provided by teacher prep programs? In other words, how are they all going to be able to, or do they all provide it, implement it equally?
That's a great question. EdTPA, the structure of EdTPA is very consistent with research on effective teaching, and the 15 constructs that are measured in those fields are consistent with the research on effective teaching, and it's very consistent with the INTAS standards and with the pedagogical standards of various subject areas. That said, within that common architecture and within our support system, programs have a great deal of flexibility about the timing in which they implement EdTPA. We do say that it's a capstone and it should be embedded in a later clinical experience, but programs have a great deal of latitude for the timing of when a candidate submits and gets their scores back. The scoring isn't like other licensure exams where you have only 1 or 2 or 3 times a year when you can be scored. It's pretty much a year-round rolling scoring process. So that allows for a great deal of flexibility. And I know Renee and Julie every program is unique. Every program has a set of values and a mission that will vary. And so the way they take up EdTPA should be consistent with that mission and values, and still provide candidates the opportunity to develop the knowledge and skills needed to demonstrate readiness to teach in those 15 core constructs. I hope
this is kind of where my mind is. So we got 40 plus teacher prep programs in Tennessee, and they're not all at the same grade level. So I wonder if they will implement EdTPA at the same quality level. And if, I'm sure that's a rhetorical question in my mind, if that's the case, then if the lower we set the cut score, the more we would be encouraging those schools that are not performing at the level they should be to not improve.
I see where you're going. I would like to say that as an educative assessment, what programs have learned by doing EdTPA has helped to lift all boats, if you know what I mean, that programs that are strong have opportunity to learn, and programs that have more struggle will have a very clear set of data to help them see gaps. And because of the networks that have been set up around the country and within states, there's a high level of collaboration and support for one another. Tennessee is a good example of that. Julie could say more about how TACTI has provided opportunities for people to be convened and learn more about EdTPA and to support one another. So actually, I'd love to hand things over to them to talk about how programs have used EdTPA in actionable ways for program improvement. Because I know when Renee was at Memphis, that was a big draw for their use of EdTPA, as well as places around the state.
Okay. Renee and Julie? Go. Bill, we'll get back to you on some numbers. I think we're looking for those numbers
fine.
that you asked for.
I got that we had just over 1,000 candidates take the EdTPA between January and June of 2015. And generally we have about 6,000 candidates, so it's a good portion, but
1,000 out of 6,000, is that, okay?
And how many pass? Back to Nathan.
I'd have to go back. I have it. There wasn't a cut score, right? So, but we could look at how many had above a 37. I'll find out for you, Mike.
Okay. Now, Julie and Renee.
I'll start, and simply because we were part of the TBR Ready to Teach initiative, we started this a long time ago. 2010 is when we really started talking about this. And so TBR did give us the option to implement, to choose our own timeline as far as implementation goes. And that's definitely something that I want to stress, is the importance of not setting EPPs up for failure, in that they need enough time to implement it into their programs, because it does take quite a few changes and just a shift, I guess, in thinking of how you're going to implement it. And so in the spring of 2011, we only had 35 take it. It was the TPA at that point. It wasn't even EdTPA.
Yeah, we knew TPA before Ed was around. That's
Yes, yes. And so then in 11-12, we had 19. In 12-13, we bumped it up to all of our off-campus locations, and so that was 158 students. And then really in 13-14 is when we went full scale with 365 of our candidates who did EdTPA. And so we've been working on this since 2010, and it's 2016. Something that speaks to, I think, the importance of that time to implement is that in that 13-14 year, when we had 365, at Tennessee Tech, our average score was 37. Or actually, no, I'm sorry, it was 39. It was 39 with the 365 candidates in 13-14. The next year, we still had over 300 candidates, and our average score was 42. This past year, 276, so just under 300 candidates, our average score was 46. So it's taken a while to get to those numbers, and that, I guess that's telling a little bit of something about Tennessee Tech, but I think that's important to note, that it's taken several years to get there, and we've been working on it for a long time.
What distribution did you have around those average scores?
I don't have that in front of me. We could get that. We could get some of those numbers if you wanted additional information, but I definitely write down those average scores for you. And we have a good range of course, our bulk of our candidates they are elementary ed, but we have all the other programs. I mean, from art, music, PE, to all the secondary areas and SPED, early childhood. So we have all of those areas. So that includes the full group.
And that, I think, sometimes hits on some of the challenges that we face, because art ed and some of our other areas of licensure are not even a part of our School of Education sometimes. So you have to work across campus, and enforcing and implementing some of those things is sometimes a challenge with working with different groups. And as Julie mentioned, and Andrea as well, I was at the University of Memphis during that transition period of implementation since 2009. And I think we started out with maybe 35 students, and then we did local evaluation. So we trained several faculty to do that scoring from the very beginning, which was a wonderful opportunity to see what was expected with the writing and the submission of the assessment for EdTPA, because it is a very different way of thinking. I think it is the right way to think as we challenge our teacher candidates to be more of a reflective practitioners. So now in my new role at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, they had started the process of moving toward EdTPA because Georgia is an EdTPA state. And so what we looked at last year, they were, I have had the opportunity to look at the scores from last year. I think they had 18 teacher candidates who were planning to work in Georgia. And so because of that, they wanted to go ahead and take the EdTPA or participate in the EdTPA. So I think they had 18, and 75% of them passed with the requirement for the state of Georgia at 35. So that was, I think, a good pilot group, and then we are expanding that even this fall to include another 53 53 students this semester. And we're going into pre-K and middle school is where we're going to be. And with Georgia, and I think that's something else to think about, just because I've had a little bit of experience with looking at what they require the EdTPA that addresses math, the elementary education, which addresses math and literacy. At Memphis, we implemented literacy was the focus. So there are different types of assessments and EdTPA tests that could be used. So I think that would be another question as to what we're going to be looking at in the state of Tennessee. What is going to be required across the board as far as elementary or pre-K through 3? What is the focus? Is it going to be that math and literacy, or is it just going to be literacy? Because we felt like in Memphis it was important for us to focus on literacy so that we could improve those skills.
That gets to another question I had earlier and I've forgotten about, but under elementary education, you can do one that's elementary education across all those, but you can focus on literacy or math, or I've forgotten what I think it was 3 of them.
Yeah.
There are 3 different ones. So, and actually, I was going to bring that up because in your all's document, the elementary education rubric or EdTPA is here. That one is a little bit different because it includes math and literacy, and it has 18 rubrics. And so instead of the 15 that is required for the majority of the other EdTPAs. So Pearson does have a different recommended score for it because of the 18 rubrics. Not listed here are the 2 EdTPAs, elementary literacy and elementary math. And so that is what the majority of our candidates do. They choose. And some of that too depends on their placements, and if they get placed with a teacher who's teaching mostly math or mostly literacy, then naturally they fall into that particular EdTPA. And so we have, I don't know the exact split, but we do have a good combination of students who do, half who do literacy and maybe half who do math. But ours have not done the elementary education that's combined.
No, Memphis did not either. And we started out with the literacy, and then I think we allowed them to choose either math or literacy, as we moved forward with the growing of the numbers with the EdTPA. Mm-hmm.
So if they take the focus on literacy, will they get a license on math and literacy? So what do we give up?
Well,
by
and remember,
doing
this
that?
is one of the series of required tests. So we still have a content test that's required for elementary, which includes the math and the literacy.
And
So
they still take the coursework that's required for math and other content that has to be taught K through 5.
Still doing clinical.
That's right.
Right, they're still in those classrooms that teach both math and literacy.
So is the answer to that question, we're not giving up anything? Because that would almost argue that the value of it in the first place is not there. We're obviously giving up something.
Well, and I think we need to, there's no way to have an in-depth, reflective, specific test for every content. So I think what allows us or how I think effective EdTPA can be for us is that even if we're focusing on literacy, let's say we're in a math class, we can still tie in the academic language. We could talk about a variety of skills that also are incorporated, whether you're dealing with literacy or math or other contents, because it still teaches the teacher candidate to be reflective in how they teach. And they use that planning skill and the instruction skill as well as the assessment to make decisions about what they do. So I'm not going to say that it's not important to identify the content, but that the skill that they're learning is going to be there regardless of the content they're teaching.
And if you think about the PLT, which is what that's the pedagogy. That's what we're looking at, and EdTPA does that, whether it's focusing on math or whether it's focusing on literacy.
And I guess just Mike, to help you too, I mean, my understanding is that, again, for the pedagogy piece, what we're really trying to assess is how a teacher takes content knowledge and uses it in a reflective sort of way to assess student learning. So, doing that through the lens of a content is important, but then having the content tests, set aside specifically to know, do they have mastery of content at a level that you would then believe if they're mastering the pedagogy piece, they'd be able to apply that in the same way, even if, so it's content through the lens of a pedagogy assessment in the case of EdTPA versus just content. And by marrying those together, I think you get a better picture. But I would be curious if Andrea has any comments on that in terms of what you see nationally in other states and how they're sort of thinking about that piece.
Yeah, thank you. I was hoping I get to chime in on this. As they were explaining, all 27 versions of EdTPA share a common architecture of the 3 tasks and the 15 core constructs. But there's subject-specific student learning elements and subject-specific pedagogical elements embedded. For elementary candidates, we started with the choice, elementary literacy or elementary mathematics. That had been the process in California, because in California, in addition to taking a TPA in one field, programs had a responsibility of developing embedded signature assessments or formative assessments of teaching in the other subject areas. Those were also embedded in clinical practice or embedded in methods courses, and so on. So as in Tennessee, there's a variety of ways for elementary candidates to demonstrate that they can teach all the elementary subjects. And with as we were developing EdTPA, there was a request from states that there could be 2 subject areas assessed, both literacy and math. So what we did is we took the common architecture of the 3 tasks for literacy and added a 4th task that focuses on analyzing student learning in mathematics. So it's a shorter sort of cycle of inquiry about teaching in math, where candidates analyze a whole class set of math performance, and then based on the performance of those students, they plan what we call re-engagement lessons, teach those lessons to those youngsters, and then reflect on the impact on student learning. So it's a whole package for elementary. We are currently discussing a 4th option for elementary, which would be the 3-task cycle of inquiry in mathematics with a 4th task analyzing student learning and literacy. So this is on the drawing boards at this point, but it is another option. And in Washington State, as same as in California, Wisconsin, Illinois, it's a choice. Programs, not individual candidates necessarily, but programs choose which of the versions they're going to use. And in Washington, they have a stipulation that over time, they have to have about a 50-50 or maybe a 60-40 ratio of candidates taking the math version or the literacy version. In Georgia and New York and in Alabama, I believe, the 4-task model is a requirement.
One of the topics that you all have mentioned in your earlier discussion was around changes to the program that needed to be made. So could you talk a little bit about what types of adjustments needed to be made to candidate coursework or to the courses that faculty delivered, and kind of what that timeline looks like to make those course adjustments?
Sure. Well, you've heard our timeline already, so we've been at it for a little while, and I'll tell you, at our institutions, any kind of change takes years to come about, especially with curriculum, because it has to pass through all the committees. So we did change some coursework. We've added courses along the way. There is this academic language that is embedded in EdTPA, and that's one of the key components that really needs to get into the curriculum for the students. And so that, that can take a while to really think through that and decide which courses you want these different elements implemented into, and then making those changes. But part of that along the way in changing the courses, the faculty training is also essential. And so EdTPA, they do have lots of resources. There are conferences that we've sent our faculty to, regional conferences. We decided 2 years ago in the state of Tennessee to hold our own EdTPA conference. And so we'll have our third EdTPA conference this year in November. So we're planning that right now. We've had over 100 faculty members attend those each year. The local evaluation training is a really good option for faculty members that Scale and Pearson offer. Come out and train faculty, not to actually do the evaluation of the EdTPA portfolios, but it's really like a deep dive into the rubrics and the tasks, and so it's a more intense training that they can do with so many faculty members. So we've offered that for with trainers from Scale each of the years that we've had our EdTPA conference. We also have faculty who go and they are trained to be official scorers for EdTPA, and that's been a huge help because it really gets them in this mindset of, this is the academic language, these are the things that we need to be looking for, and so all of that does take time.
Yeah, and I would think, I guess to add to that, because I have transitioned to a new institution that's not fully implemented, those are some things we're looking at right now. We've been working this summer because we're going to have to make those curricular changes very quickly. One of those would be to reevaluate the assessment courses that are in place so that we make sure students or teacher candidates have an understanding of what it means to be a reflective assessor of their students in order to use that information and move forward. One thing before we wrap up, I want to just mention, there is a financial cost for implementing EdTPA. We do have, with the technology, when we think about videotaping, if we want to have quality videotaping, we need lapel mics, we need the equipment that's necessary, and that for students to use on a large scale is very costly. So I would think just asking to keep in mind what might be something that could be offered incentive, to just think about that moving forward, because TBR was able to think a little bit creatively, and those, now that I'm in a different system and just starting, that's a struggle with where the financial support's going to come in through the implementation.
So a lot of the EPPs have implemented course fees or just a student fee that's associated with this, and that's the way that we did it in TBR. We had a little bit of choice, but we chose course fees, and so we attached it to certain fees that we knew our licensure candidates were taking, and so that's how they were assessed, and that's how we had that pot of money to pay the $300 per candidate, which is a huge deal when we have 365 candidates. That's big. And so I know that Scale has a document that they've published that uses Vanderbilt and UT Knoxville as an example, but there is a good list of EPPs who say that it's some kind of lab fee, that's how they've covered the cost of that. So it's not an immediate burden on the student, and they can cover it with financial aid. Because right now we have students who can't pay for their praxis tests, that might just be $146. So a $300 hit is a big one.
You're including that in the fees right, still paying it.
That's right.
Right. It's not out of their pocket at that time.
Back to the timeline again, we've talked about 2019 and so forth, which to us seems like an eternity, that, we need to do this much quicker. But specifically, how do you relate to that being a timeline? It's practically impractical, or?
Well, and Renee may be able to speak more toward this because we feel good. We're
They're
good
ahead
to
of the
go.
game.
We feel ahead of the game right now. But I had written that down, and if EPPs needed to meet about curricular changes right now, that won't happen this year. It won't happen until next year, and so that it's tight. That, to me, it feels like a tight timeline for an EPP who hasn't implemented it already.
Right. Yeah. And I know we have some suggested implementation rotation, but I think it is maybe an additional year, I think might be more realistic, because I think what's important is you want to roll it out correctly and not have to make a tremendous amount of changes as you go along. I think what's wonderful, and like Julie mentioned, the EdTPA conference that has already been established in Tennessee has been so helpful, I think, to others. So there are, I think, support that's available, but maybe a situation where a more purposeful, this year, let's roll out this amount, and maybe just an effort in implementation by 2019, or if we want to set certain percentage along the way, might be more beneficial than everyone, just because, as I mentioned before, when we're dealing with art and music and theater and other content areas that are not even affiliated with our schools of education, trying to reach those groups across campus is sometimes problematic.
If I might interject on the timeline too, from other states, some states have had a year where it's where EdTPA is a requirement for program completion, but they aren't. It isn't consequential for licensure, where everybody has to do it, and that provides a really tremendous database for establishing a passing standard. But it does give programs another year to collect data, to implement before it's fully consequential. So New Jersey is having a conversation about that. That was definitely the case in Wisconsin. Oregon also has that plan. And that way, if you have 2 years or 2.5 years for piloting and field testing, then you have a full year of full implementation with no consequence. And then it would be the following year when the passing standard would be in play. And Nathan is there on the scene. He can probably say more about how that varies by other states. But that sort of ramp-up process has been very, very beneficial.
And it's not just the curricular changes. I know that's something that we've talked about, but you do have to think about these programs finding the resources or the money to send faculty members to training, to pay for that, or to purchase the video cameras that students need for recording, or just a handful of other things to reach out to those other content areas that may not be in your college. Those things also take time.
And keep in mind as well, as we're thinking about moving forward and implementing this, I think it's going to be critical that the partner districts, our LEAs, are on board and have an understanding. I know I had a meeting this week and they had not even heard of EdTPA. So that's going to be a critical piece as well, is to make sure that the communication is there and they're on board, because now we're including videotaping of children in the classroom, those type of situations that come up.
My experience in dealing with faculties in a number of colleges, I understand what you're saying, but I also feel that in many cases, faculty don't move until they have to. And so I see some advantages of having deadlines out there that they have got to, you don't have a year or 2 years to think about it. They got to do something now. And so
I would reiterate, though, I'm going to take up for fellow faculty
Yeah.
and say that they do need training and they're going to need some support to make sure it's rolled out effectively. What you don't want to happen is for it to feel like it's a compliance check sheet and it doesn't have the robustness that we would all want for our candidates. And I would just underscore the funding piece of this. And the vast number of folks across Tennessee, candidates who have not done this before. And so the rollout does need to be done in such a way that we understand that funding component and how folks have to get that to be part of their program does take some lead time. I am probably most concerned about the funding piece of all of the things we've talked about, because it is an expense on top of expenses that are already part of a clinical placement fee, an internship fee. At the university where I was, we were actually already charging $300 to help offset the cost of paying the supervising teachers, the folks out in the field within the school districts to partner with us. And so the fee can be extraordinary when that's also the semester that they can't work because they're in the student teaching or internship. It's the semester that they're paying for their praxis exams. It's the semester that they have the lab fees that may already be associated and the EdTPA. You're talking about the potential of $1,000 fee for a student who's already paying tuition and not working. So I just want to keep that in mind as we think about how this will be rolled out.
I do also want to mention something that Renee mentioned about videotaping students. I think that's something we've got to take very seriously. And Michael Durline, who's on my team, participated in a national network that looked at creating some data security standards. And I think that's something else that we should consider as we require EdTPA, and making sure that we have the right policies in place also about our expectations related to that, because I think we want to make sure all of our providers and their students are taking the right steps to make sure that we have the right permissions and the right security when we handle these videos. I've spent some time talking with Pearson, and I feel good about once the videos get in their hands that the security is there. But there's sort of a chain of those pieces of evidence that we need to make sure that in Tennessee we all have a clear understanding of the protocols and expectations related to that as well. So I think there are a lot of parts to this work, which is another reason not to move too quickly, so that we don't make a mistake that has unintended consequences.
How do we move deliberately but still have a stake in the ground, and come 19 or whenever it is, we're there? Whether the provost bought in or the chancellor bought in or not, or you got the, come that date, whatever the lead time is, it's a go without forgiveness.
I think you've got to have the leadership in place to make things happen. And then also, I think is necessary is, I liked what Andrea shared regarding the no consequences. And that might be a couple of semesters of, let's just get a baseline of data. Because we will need to make a decision about cut scores. I know we have a lot of data already with the TBR institutions. I think some 1,000, is that what you said? How many
We had
students?
1,000 students in the past 6 months.
Okay, okay.
And that was, I said 6,000. It was out of more close in the mid 4,500 range.
Okay, okay. So that's a large number.
It's still
to
a large number of our candidates.
That's right.
And I think that one of the things that we've talked about is, are there ways to incentivize providers to do this uptake more quickly before it does become that required for licensure component? So if in 2018, 19, could we have a year that's no consequences, but where we were seeing 90% of our candidates or close to that, participating or something along those lines?
Another whole issue that we didn't even have time to discuss is the writing aspect. It's an intensive amount of time of writing, and sometimes students need a little support with the writing aspect of being analytical thinkers. And that, I guess, goes along with the curriculum changes that need to be in place. But that is something we've struggled with at Memphis, and then even I've noticed it at UTC. We've just got to make sure that their writing skills, although we're not evaluating writing, it is important that they can articulate their thoughts and explain the reflection that's happening.
Does any of that get to admissions standards into the program?
You all require a writing sample, or do you use the core knowledge?
That we do the core.
Okay.
Or ACT. But.
Okay. Because we're tossing around the idea of using the core knowledge writing sample or the writing exam requirement for everyone. Because if they do not pass that standardized writing or that writing exam of core knowledge praxis 1, then they would not move forward in our program. That would be an entrance exam, if you will.
And I would add, over time, you would hope that your TN Ready proficiency
That's
score
right.
would also give you that information around writing.
That's
and
right.
Obviously, in a few years, we'll be able to see that.
Right.
Okay, other questions for Julie and Renee? Let me, Bill, or do you have a question?
Yeah, just a real quick one. At some point, what happens when a student doesn't do well? When can they take the test again? How many times could they potentially take it? Walk us through just a little bit of what happens when a student has a disappointing score and feedback they get when they're able to take the test again, and just a picture of how that reflection happens.
Currently, we have a policy where it depends on where their score is, like how low below our cut score it is. And so if it's a couple points, we do an internal evaluation and remediation. And so we have someone who's trained to work closely with them to talk about where they went wrong in which task, and they redo that particular piece. EdTPA also offers remediation, $100 per task if they just need to remediate on one task. We've rarely, I guess, had any student who needed to remediate all 3 tasks. But if we have a student score low enough, then we do have them redo that and send it back to Pearson. And so for us, it depends on how low their score actually is.
And I think, too, something to keep in mind is the uploading time period, because we've discussed that even at UTC, is that we want to make sure we upload early enough so that scores can be sent back in order for us to make decisions about graduation, licensure, and so forth, especially if there's problems, so that that remediation can take place.
Okay?
Thank you.
Kind of summarize where I think we are in terms of recommendations. One, I think that our learning here with the EdTPA is great. I think it's, the objectives and the process, so forth, are excellent, and I think we need to proceed in that manner. I think I don't know that we're ready to identify a timeline at this point, but I certainly think that we need to be moving forward with it as quickly as we possibly can. We've got to address the cost issue, obviously, but it also, I guess, the other learning is kind of our next subject here, is that we're still going to need to have a content assessment some way that is not going to replace the need for content. That it's really the ability to teach that we're looking at here. Sarah, want to kind of bring this to a point where we've got some recommendations coming forward from the committee here.
Yeah, no, I think this has been a really helpful discussion. I really appreciate Julie and Renee and Andrea joining us by phone, because I think it's important for us to think about a smart, strategic, thoughtful rollout with urgency. And I think, hearing you, Julie, talk about how prepared you are at Tech to go forward, I mean, I think we're gonna have to think carefully about what's our state level expectation for all programs, given that a lot of our programs are ready to go. Some of our programs are not as ready to go, and we want to be sort of mindful of that. I think the cost considerations that Candace mentioned, we really have to think about as a state and be prepared to give guidance to programs about how to address that in a way that makes sense for candidates and doesn't set us up for any further issues there. Right now, we're talking about a January 2019 timeline, and I do think Andrea presented a few ideas that I jotted down in terms of thinking about how we might couch that slightly in a more nuanced way in terms of what that means for our expectations. Is it, certain areas that we want to move forward with in terms of literacy and sort of some of the secondary academic content areas? Is it a 90% expectation but without stakes for the candidate that first year? I mean, I think there's probably a few things that we need to bring back to the drawing table before final reading in October to think about in terms of maybe putting a finer point on that recommendation. But I heard some good suggestions here, and I think, we can maybe put something together in follow-up to give to the subcommittee for consideration, and then think about what that means for a recommendation to the board in October.
I do like the first year being, a no harm year, basically, but I think that's probably a good practice.
I might call it, and we're doing this with how we're transitioning with our district and school accountability model, where you have a year that's really a transparency year. The metrics are transparent, and you're sharing that publicly, and you're getting your data systems in place. And then the next year, you would use it as more of a set cut score, and your accountability sort of kicks in. I think that's a great way to position it. And to Sarah's point, and maybe there is a way in that first year, or for early adopters and however we want to transition it, you could think about some small grant funding or incentive funding to help get people started, particularly on the training piece. I think we had talked about that several months ago, and we should probably reconsider that as we go forward.
I was jotting that down. I do think we need to think about sort of where we could get support for sort of initial funding, but because we don't want that to be the reason that we can't move forward with urgency. I mean, I think we could probably find partners to help us support maybe some of the short-term funding needs.
Hey, what have we missed? What do we need to wrap up on the TPA thing? Are we ready to move to the next item on our agenda, the content?
The only thing I would bring up as we're summarizing is going back to what requirement we want to make for elementary. I think that we need to come to a decision related to that.
Literacy, math, or both.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. And I think that I've got the same question when we get to middle school too, because I think one of the things that we've really wrestled with over the years, that particularly in middle school, the math content is not good. Of course, we're still talking about math, but
So now just as a reminder, our endorsement structure is subject specific in middle school. So the Ed TPA that they would do would be correlated. Well, the Ed TPA, if I'm not mistaken, is a middle grades, but you would do your content in. So if you're becoming
gotta
a
do
math
your content and
through the middle grades Ed TPA.
okay.
And dual focus is not an issue, is not an option.
It could be an option. Yes.
Is there a recommendation from you guys?
Oh, wait, are you
either
talking about elementary or middle? I'm sorry.
elementary?
Oh. Well, there is an elementary Ed TPA that combines both. Then as I understood it, there's an elementary Ed TPA that focuses on literacy, and some states add a fourth task related to math, and it sounded like Andrea was saying that they're developing the reverse of that. So where there would be a focus on math and then a fourth task that would be literacy. So I think there are a variety of options that we could consider related to our requirement for elementary, and it could be that we start by allowing our preparation providers to have some choices, and then we look at data and see what the data tells us about the various options that we have.
It feels to me, unless the subcommittee members on the phone and here have strong feelings about any of these issues around cost, around the elementary requirement, around the 2019 sort of expectations, that the department and the state board staff should go back to the drawing board and rough out some potential suggestions for how we think about those three buckets, and then bring that to the subcommittee via email for feedback like we did after the last meeting, and try to come to a place where we've got some proposals for you all as a subcommittee first, and then for the board.
And I would add to that also, as part of those suggestions that we bring back, to really think about the full theory of action in our strategic plan and how the content test and the Ed TPA funnel together so we get the most result.
Okay, Andrea, Julie, Renee, good job. Renee, we enjoyed being at your university for our last meeting. We
Yes,
certainly
I enjoyed that
appreciate-
too. Thank you
yeah,
for coming.
Yeah, but we appreciate your involvement in these discussions, a very good discussion. We're running behind a little bit here. Let's take a quick break and keep that to about 5 minutes if we possibly can. I'll come back and we'll talk about content. Hey, Bill, are you still on?
I'm here, thank you.
Great. Lillian, you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, we'll move to the 10:15 item on our agenda. We'll declare that it is 10:15 and move forward. The content assessment goals and needs. Okay, who's gonna kick that off? Amy.
So we're excited to talk with you a little bit in more depth today about content assessments as well. This is another topic that we've been talking about for quite some time. So we wanted to share with you our thoughts on our needs related to content assessments. And certainly if you have additional things that we should be considering, we'd like to hear those. We know that we want content assessments that are closely aligned with our Tennessee student standards. And as such, if we determine that we need to develop additional assessments, we would need support both in terms of the process of developing assessments and the logistics of doing that work. We also think that it's important to consider streamlining our assessment structure. Currently, for some of our endorsement areas, there are as many as 5 or 6 praxis tests that they're required to take if you include the PLT exams in addition to the content area exams that they have to take. And I would point out our elementary folks and our special education folks particularly in that group. We also think that it's important to think about a reasonable timeline for development and adoption of any new content assessment that we have. Again, as we talked about EdTPA implementation, we want to make sure we're moving with some level of urgency, but that we take the time that's necessary to make sure that we come out with a high quality product. So in terms of thinking about what areas of our content assessments we might want to consider first, we're proposing that we think about reading. We currently use the teaching of reading exam that is offered by Praxis, and then we also think we should consider our secondary mathematics exam, another exam that we've been talking about for quite some time. In addition, though, if we think about going in a different direction with assessments, we want to make sure that we have assessment options that are secure and accessible. It's important that our candidates are able to get access to take the exams without incredible expectations for traveling long distances or things like that.
You get ready to, no, go ahead.
And then finally, one of the additional things that the state is interested in are tools for sophisticated data analysis. And I think that we are interested in making sure that we have access to exam data that we need to be able to answer some of the questions that you ask of us. I'll give you examples like we'd like to know how first-time test takers perform versus those candidates who have to repeat assessments. We're also interested in, where available and where appropriate, being able to gather data about, within an assessment, not just necessarily the overall score, but again, where it's appropriate, the components of an assessment. I think that helps us better understand where our candidates are struggling, and not just us, but also our providers.
Go back.
Yes, sir.
Please. Okay, so secondary mathematics, would that be subject matter?
Yes.
Okay, so it would, however many of those courses, each one would have an assessment.
Unbundling algebras and
I think that we haven't made a decision about that. I think what we are suggesting is that that would be the area that we would start to consider what other options we might develop, and that could include an intermediate or an Algebra 1 as well as an advanced mathematics assessment.
So
we're not today proposing what that structure would look like.
I would encourage, as you look through that, look forward to the day that you walk into the board and you say, we recommend you set blank for not only a license but an endorsement, and you get the question, how did you determine that candidate has the competency, knowledge, and calculus for us to give them an endorsement? If you can answer that question, it's easier for us to, that's the part that started this thing to unravel was with the 60 questions and the 32 of them, right? And So if we're going to do it, let's get it to where, which brings me to the next deal. Because the deal sort of came apart on mathematics, frankly, and because there is a timeline, which means this is not going to go into effect this year, next year, or whatever. So there's going to be a lead time. I've got, when you look at physics, you look at biology, you look at chemistry, and I would love for someone who's knowledgeable about literature. I don't want to go and do reading and math, go through that lead time, and then jump in and start biology and go through its lead time. If we're going to do it, let's just do it.
So let me jump in and say we can consider all or a few. And so our comments today are these are ones that we would prioritize based on, one, our strategic plan, and two, the conversations we've had with this team. But certainly you could go, as my mom used to say, whole hog, and you could jump in and say, we're going to make all the changes at one time and create this timeline that we're all moving together with new tests for the vast majority of our endorsement areas. So that is absolutely a possibility and something we want to discuss today.
So this is the rationale for going whole hog. Biology or chemistry test was like 125 questions and 52 correct answers, and we gave an endorsement in high school chemistry, and that advised me in no way as to what that person knows in chemistry. So we're endorsing someone to go into a classroom in front of Tennessee students. If we didn't have to give an endorsement, I wouldn't feel so guilty about it, but I don't know if that person knows the content as well as what we do know about the pedagogical skills. So if there's any course that we have decided Tennessee students need to know, then we need to know that teacher at the earliest possible moment knows not only have the pedagogical skills, but the pedagogical content knowledge. I say whole hog.
And just to kind of add, and I think this will come out in the conversation and sort of our initial discussion, I mean, there's going to be some considerations for us to think about in terms of what even that means to go for all of them at once. You can use, because we got to think about state
Sarah didn't use the
reciprocity.
whole hog term.
Bring it on, Sarah.
Go whole hog. We want to go whole hog. We just got to think about a few things that'll come up. I mean, is it off-the-shelf assessments? Is it state customized? If it's state customized, we got to think about the fact that we surround 8 states and what does that mean for our policy around reciprocity. Just there's going to be some things to think about, but I think we've got a lot of options, and I'm excited for this conversation to kind of explore how and what we want to do in terms of our content assessment.
Oh,
And I appreciate you, Mike, talking about the alignment. I mean, that's the key. It's the alignment of what our expectations for teachers to what our expectations are for when they get in the field and are working with students with these standards. And so I think that's all of our goal, and it's how do we get there with the capacity that we will need to bring to this type of work.
Because I think it's important to say that there would be for lack of a better term, a standard setting task force related to every single test that we would create. And so even with external support on that, that's a lot to manage and maintaining high quality across the board. And while we might want to consider all of our assessments, I would say maybe we would even do a few phases though, where we start a set and then start another set, not necessarily waiting the entire 18 months that it would require to create a set of initial assessments, but maybe phasing them in.
But, all right, yes. And I know you're not arguing against this point, but I'm going to make the point that the longer it is delayed, the more at risk those students are in that classroom. So the fidelity needs to, the urgency needs to be the sooner we know that lit teacher really is competent in high school literature or whatever, the responsibilities of those kids.
I completely agree with you, and that just requires then that we have a capacity plan for how we adequately manage all of that work simultaneously.
Okay.
In addition, we think that our assessments need to allow us to conduct analyses of the data for multiple reasons, and we always want to keep these reasons in mind. Statewide analyses to inform policy and research. I think that again comes back to our question about, do these assessments actually give us the information that we need in order to feel confident that our educators are prepared to enter our classrooms. But in addition, we also want to make sure that these assessments are giving our ed prep providers information about their own candidates that allows them to make changes and to their programs in order to better prepare their candidates. And then finally, for the candidate themselves, very helpful if they can understand, even if they pass the exam, maybe where there's still significant room for improvement as they move into their first years of teaching. And then if their schools can have that information as well, it helps, support that continuous learning that we've talked about today. I did want to highlight the reading assessment. That has been one that we have spent a lot of time talking about at the department and with the board staff. Our current assessment is the Teaching Reading Elementary Education, which is a part of the Praxis series developed by ETS. There is an alternative option. Sarah mentioned customized versus off the shelf. So one way to move quickly is to take an assessment that has already been developed that we think is highly aligned with our student standards and expectations that we can use. And so one option is the Foundations of Reading assessment developed by Pearson, and they can speak more about the development of the assessment. But I believe that it was first developed for Massachusetts, and that since then multiple other states have become interested in using it, such that it has been made available to other states and has a reputation of being a strong assessment of a teacher's readiness to provide reading instruction. We wanted to provide just a little overview of a comparison of the two assessments. On the left side, you see the column, and that is the assessment that we currently use, the Praxis series, Teaching Reading Elementary Education. It's a multiple choice assessment with some constructed response items. It takes about 2.5 hours for the educator to take the test at a cost of $146. It does cover the 5 essential components of reading instruction, and as you can see, it's used in 4 other states, and then there's also another teaching reading test that Praxis offers. It's not focused on elementary education, but 13 states use that other assessment. The Pearson Foundations of Reading assessment is also multiple choice, 100 questions and 2 open response items. It takes about 4 hours to complete and has a marginally higher cost of $155. Also covers the 5 essential components of reading, and as you can see, 7 other states currently use this assessment.
So how are they different? Other than it takes 4 hours and it's $9 more.
Want me to speak to
I would love for you to
Okay.
speak to that.
I'll speak to it, and certainly our folks from Pearson can speak to it as well. But primarily, when you are looking at the main differences, you have a bit more robustness in terms of what I would consider the scientific foundation of reading in the new test under Pearson. I can give you a breakdown specifically. So on like the foundations piece of reading, if you look at the actual Praxis test, it's about 27% of the test is on this foundational skill set of reading. On the Pearson test, it's about 35% of the test. If you look at content on the praxis, there's a component that's around reading development, how a child becomes a reader. That's around 46% of the test on the praxis. And then the Pearson test really splits it up a little bit differently. So there's an area that's about the development of reading comprehension, which, as you know, is a significant focus for us in Tennessee. It's a robust part of our standards from pre-K all the way up. And there's 27% of the test on the development of reading comprehension. So it breaks out where when you look at the breakout on the praxis test, it's a bulk that's around 46% on this reading development piece. On the Pearson test, it's broken out a little bit more distinctly. So you see a large component on comprehension, and then there's a specific component, 18% of the test on reading, assessment, and instruction. And then there are 2 open-ended response questions that are around 20% on this new test, the Pearson test, that's on this integration of knowledge and understanding. That compares to, there are constructive response questions on the ETS or the praxis test as well. So constructive response you're going to see on both of them. They are slightly different in focus. Again, I would describe the primary difference on the Pearson test to be around this robustness on the foundations of reading. It's much more specific. I have taken the ETS test, so I can speak to that one pretty well. And in taking it, it's a good test. I mean, I would say it's got the foundations of reading in it. You definitely have the balanced literacy components in it. There's a focus in on assessment, but there's specificity in the foundations of reading tests on Pearson that's just different. It's definitely more specific around exactly, decoding skills or phonics, and there's very specific questions around sounds or letters that make that sound. So the specificity is what's primarily different on the foundations and the skills components. An example might be on a question that's on an ETS test, you may have a question around what's the type of assessments that you would need to look at to ensure that a student was reading on grade level. And there would be multiple questions that you would, or answers you would pick from. On the ETS test, or the Pearson test, there would be something more specific about the exact type of assessment and what does that assessment tell you about that student's reading ability. So just the focus of it is slightly different. Again, the test we currently use is a good test. I mean, it gives you information about that teacher's ability to go into a classroom and teach reading, but it's not at the specificity that would match potentially better to our specific state standards that we are even rolling out next year in terms of early foundation.
What kind of transition problems or challenges do you have in moving from one to the other? What do you have to go back and change a whole bunch of curriculum or anything to make that change? Or
well, in terms of what you're actually teaching in the courses, you would hope that the college professors and the clinical experiences are already getting at the content. But when you are a professor of a course like this, you do look at what's the content on the actual exam, the licensure exam the teacher is taking. And so you backward map that into your courses. So if it's more specific, this is what you're going to do in your course. You're going to make it much more specific on various particular skills or comprehension components. And so that's what we would hope would happen, is that if you weren't at that level of specificity, you would create that, because that's where you're going to help students of all needs as they come into the classroom, because everyone comes in, as you know, in reading in particular, with very different needs.
Oh, it really tell us to shut up and get the Pearson people up here at any time, because I understand that. But at some point, one of my curiosities is there data that shows performance of teachers who have gone through the Pearson on their reading versus the ETS?
I think that Pearson is best positioned to answer that question, and the former commissioner from Massachusetts, David Driscoll, is here to speak. But I'll just give a little lead in, and it's my understanding that in Massachusetts, they did see increases in student achievement following the introduction of what was then the MTEL assessment, which now the reading component of that is the Foundations of Reading test that we are considering here. We certainly haven't implemented this in Tennessee, so we wouldn't have Tennessee-specific
Oh,
data,
no.
of course.
I wouldn't expect.
Right.
Okay.
I'll turn it over now.
And I believe Dr. Driscoll may be kicking us off, but I do want to say that, reiterate what Amy said. Dr. Driscoll did lead some of the work in the transition to this new test, particularly Foundations of Reading and some others in the state of Massachusetts as the former commissioner, and so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. Last time I saw the chairman a couple of years ago, we had the opportunity to look over NAEP results, and it showed that Tennessee was the most improved state in the country, and he couldn't tell anybody, so it was kind of tough. But now the whole country knows.
I had some people in Tennessee mad at me because I didn't tell anybody.
Well, it's very impressive, and to your point, I think when a state gets traction on reform, it doesn't get easier. You know, you don't rest on your laurels. It actually gets harder. You start to realize these achievement gaps are even more annoying. You work actually harder. And to your point, we went whole hog, and it's a lot of work for the department to do all these committees all at once and so forth. And Barbara will talk about the process. It's a lot of work, but there's an energy that comes when you bring everybody together to do these things. So I'm with you on the whole hog part.
I enjoyed hearing someone from the north saying whole hog.
Oh, yeah.
Very nice.
Let the minutes reflect.
Well, I was saying, you know, I was mentioning to my colleagues, I mean, I've met so many wonderful people here in Nashville and in Tennessee. It's just wonderful. The only problem is you all talk funny. We'll try to be brief because I know your agenda is long. I am the former Commissioner of Education in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and we did have the opportunity back in the day to, at that time, you had two choices. You had an off-the-shelf test or a customized approach, and we chose to go the customized approach. It's actually a little bit different now. You can still do either, but the customized approach is more organized. It's, you know, we were, I don't know why, when you think about it, California had done it, New York had done it, you think we would have used some of their work. So that's really what happens now when you go customized. There's a lot of the work has been done, and therefore it makes it a little easier, but you need to do this alignment, as the commissioner mentioned, which is so key. I'm pleased to have two colleagues with me today, both of whom have had experience with at least 25 plus states in various ways and in various forms. Barbara Apple is the Director of Educator Test Development. I have to look these things up. We have these crazy titles. But she's the Director of Educator Test Development and has worked in numerous states around this issue of alignment and standard, you know, looking at Tennessee. You know, you run the show. I've mentioned this to Fielding. You run the show. You don't let the vendors run the show. You run the show. You know what Tennessee wants in terms of standards. That's what your alignment is. You want to use Tennessee people, your educators and so on. I put a legislator on one of these standard-setting committees, and it paid big dividends because they actually saw the process. Not someone that
Legislators put the legislators on these committees.
Well, that's another. We don't quite have that issue. And so Barbara will go through that whole process of how the alignment occurs and the use of Tennessee educators. Nathan Estel is here, also works with numerous states, Director of Educator Relations, and he really works with state policy makers across the country on the implementation of EdTPA. You heard his name mentioned a couple of times, and content licensure assessment. So let me begin with Barbara.
Good morning. Very pleased to be here to talk to you all, and I'm really going to describe what I'll call our full-blown, whole hog custom test development process. And I have a brief formal presentation. I hope to introduce topics that will engender some dialogue after our presentation. But our custom development, test development process generally involves 4 phases, as seen on the screen. From planning to implementation, this test development process is comprehensive and thorough, designed to meet our testing industry standards and practice, and is conducted to ensure the ongoing collection and documentation of the validity evidence that supports the use of the test for certification purposes. It's a very key concept for test development. Then our first phase, preparing for the program, involves planning, establishing the Tennessee review committees, and the standards alignment preparation. Alignment happens all throughout the process, but we need to get prepared for it. And continuous and thoughtful planning is a process that enables us to work with you so that we deliver a program that meets your vision and goals. And when things change, you get new standards, we go back and we realign and redevelop as we need, but you always have to start with a good planning process. The goals of the planning process related to test development include setting shared goals and expectations for the content and timing of the test development process that usually involves multiple layers of review and the collection of validity evidence. We confirm with you the appropriate Tennessee standards and other sources that will inform test content, and then we work with you to establish the effective test designs, including the organization of the content to be assessed and how you want that content to be reported or the assessment to be reported, the types and numbers of items to be developed, and any special scoring considerations. Also, at the start of the process, we discussed how to involve state educators in development, and the sustained and substantial participation of Tennessee educators who represent the diversity of the educator population in your state is a key aspect of developing tests that are valid for the purposes of educator certification. So practicing Tennessee educators, educator preparation program faculty, and other stakeholders you designate would be involved in reviewing test materials throughout the process. So we would work with you closely. You wonder how many committees, if you've got 50 different tests, well, you're going to have a lot of different committees. We have job analysis committees for each field. We have an equity assurance panel. We have content advisory committees selected for each field, and standard setting panels, again, one for each field. So there's a lot of people involved. And for alignment, all tests that we custom develop are guided by state standards which articulate your expectations for what educators should know and be able to do to promote student learning and achievement. This process establishes the alignment or the match between a test and the justifiable official sources of content. And for the Tennessee program, those official sources of content would include the Tennessee licensure standards and induction guidelines, the Tennessee academic standards and curriculum frameworks for students, and any other standards adopted or endorsed by you, such as InTask or the CAPE standards. We would work with you field by field to confirm the appropriate Tennessee standards and resources to inform test content. So all that planning happens up front. We start working on what we call developing. Well, you've gone far on that the slides. Okay, developing the test frameworks is the next phase, and the test frameworks involves activities that define the test content and a systematic process, again, for gathering validity evidence to demonstrate the relationship between defined test content and the educator job requirements. So at the start of framework development, we conduct a job analysis study. That involves several steps in which we bring Tennessee educators together to identify critical tasks performed on the job, make judgments regarding the links between the knowledge, skills, and abilities included in the draft test frameworks, and then the critical tasks. And then we also ask Tennessee educators to rate the importance of the components of the test frameworks in relation to the job. So we do all of that. We start the job analysis study, and then as that is started, we start drafting the frameworks, which is to document those competencies identified by your educators that are important and critical for entry-level educators in each field. The purpose of certification is for entry-level. As the frameworks are prepared, we match the alignment of each component. So here's a competency. What standard or standards is that aligned to in the Tennessee standards? So we maintain what we call a correlation table, and we update that as things are reviewed and revised, and the final version of that alignment is published in your technical report. Once the frameworks are drafted, we have your equity advisory panel, and then the field-specific content advisory committees review each draft test framework according to established guidelines and criteria. Take that framework they've reviewed, and we do a content validation study. So this is, again, very, very comprehensive. We invite currently practicing educators and the faculty at the ed prep programs throughout the state to respond to a survey that asks questions about how important is that competency to the job of an entry-level educator, and how descriptive all that additional definitional information we provide about what we're going to be testing and how does that relate, and is it important to that competency. We analyze the survey results and the results of the job analysis study, and we polish that test framework, and we bring it to you for approval with all the additional evidence and documentation. We haven't even started writing items yet. So now we're ready to start writing items. So preparing test items is a process in which we include the development of test and item specifications, which further establish requirements for the content, format, and scoring of the items. We do item development that follows the specifications. We have the item reviews, equity advisory panel, content advisory committees come back and review the items, and then we field test the items and involve a representative sample of your test candidates in Tennessee. For those responses, analyze results, determine what we should keep on the test, what we should delete from the test, what we should revise and refield test. Ready to begin?
We could breathe.
I can breathe. I'm trying to be. Thank you. I'll do that. We're now ready to begin implementing the program, and we build the first of many versions or forms of the test. We register the candidates, administer and score the test, and after the first month or so of test administration, we convene the standard setting panels. And these panels, composed again of Tennessee educators, review the tests, review the initial test results, and provide recommendations regarding the passing standard or cut score for each test. And then these recommendations are presented to the state, you all, and you all establish the passing standard that you want to have used going forward. Write up the technical report documenting the process and outcomes, and we're all set to continue implementation. Okay. Over.
Thank you.
That's the process in a nutshell.
Well done.
Poor Barbara, she was under orders for me to go quickly, so. And as you can tell, it's an awful lot of work, tremendous amount of work. There's also a lot of costs involved. That is, hotels convene people, meals, substitutes, we pay all that. And I just want to point out that we cover all that, and there's no cost to the state. This entire program is paid for by the test takers ultimately. So, all right, so let me turn it to.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
I'm sorry.
Just so that we have it, how long does this entire process generally take?
18 to 20 general.
24 months?
For a set of tests. So it's, and you can do it a little bit shorter if you want to use some already existing material. You can do it in a shorter time period, but when you're starting from scratch, it's about 18 to 24 months.
So it'd be 18 months, and then the clock would start here in implementing it in the state, and that's another 2 to 3 years.
Well, currently, when we change cut scores, we have a year lag. I think that would be a conversation we'd want to have.
With it's because you got kids who are in college. We're going to change the game on them. We might do it at their freshman year, who knows, on the sophomore. At some point, the world's going to change out from under.
What we do right now is accept if we have two different versions, we accept both versions for a little while, to allow people who possibly took it before they started student teaching and passed it and thought they were done. So we would be allowing them to use those scores that were the appropriate test and score at the time that they took the test.
So implementation could occur 18 to 24 months after you start the process, so that it starts right there. You don't have to wait another Unless you have a
have-
policy to wait,
Right.
you don't have to
I have
wait.
a few more questions. Should I wait until? I'll wait, cause it.
Okay.
may-
You can go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Nathan Estel, and I wanted to take a moment and talk about some of the states that have decided to initiate the process that Barbara just discussed, because it does seem like a daunting process. But when I take a look at the map and I think about the number of candidates who are licensed to teach, who are entering the education profession, it's greater than 50% of those candidates are graduating from a program that's in a state that requires a customized content assessment or a customized pedagogy assessment to enter the profession of teaching. So it's not entirely unique to think about taking on the task of developing a customized program. Three of the states that I want to highlight today include Illinois, California, and Massachusetts, and I have specific reasons for talking about each one of those. The state of Illinois, the reason I want to address Illinois is because it was an early adopter of the EdTPA. So currently, candidates who are graduating from educator preparation programs and applying to the state board for a license to teach have to meet the state's qualifying score on EdTPA. So having that in place as a pedagogy assessment, the State Board of Education took a step back and asked, what do we want our content licensure assessments to tell us about our candidates before we issue that license? And they recently contracted with us to begin the redevelopment of their content licensure assessments to include two key aspects that I think are important to Tennessee as well. The first of which is literacy. So across the 40-plus content licensure assessments that we're developing with Illinois educators, we're infusing items that cover the candidate's ability to deliver a literacy instruction to all candidates or to all students, and we're also looking at content-specific pedagogy because that was a goal of the state. In the initial stages of program planning that Barbara started out her presentation with, the state board, with its staff and a stakeholder group, told us that that was what was important to them. So when we developed the test frameworks and it's work that's currently underway, we kept that in mind, and we're making sure to write items and to begin to operationalize tests that measure those two additional constructs. California is a little bit different. California has offered, in general, if you think about the population of the state, some unique opportunities because of the magnitude of the population of English language learners in the state, the magnitude, the diversity of the state, not only in terms of the student population, but just the geographic areas that it covers. So when California thought about how it was going to assess content and assess literacy, it not only requires a performance assessment to cover pedagogy, it requires a content licensure assessment and also a customized assessment of literacy that all candidates take prior to the issuance of the license. Again, keeping in mind that something that was already developed in another state was not deemed appropriate for that state, just given the diversity and the opportunities that they have that diversity presents. The last state that I want to mention, and not only because Dave is here with us today, is Massachusetts, because of the foundations of reading. So Massachusetts has a performance assessment that's in place that is being developed to cover pedagogy, but we're currently developing content assessments for the state that all educators applying for a license will have to complete. But they also require candidates to take the foundations of reading. And there's been a significant discussion about the foundations of reading, so I won't take up any more time in discussing it, other than to say that since it was developed with experts in the field of literacy and the 5 essential components of reading, a number of states have taken a look at the assessment and decided that it was something that they were going to adopt in a number of different ways. So what are the different ways? One state may require it only of early childhood or elementary education candidates. In other states, they require it of those two populations. In addition, would require it of special education candidates to make sure that they have the specific knowledge that's necessary to deliver reading instruction in their classrooms. I want to shift gears quickly, and I am trying to go fast. I want to shift gears quickly and talk about how we would deliver assessments in Tennessee and what I think I heard Dr. Wooten describe as secure and accessible locations. Pearson is currently delivering professional licensure assessments outside of education in 45 different test sites across the state of Tennessee. And we had a group do an analysis to show us that the blue triangles that are on this screen are where your educator preparation programs are located compared to our test centers, and that the average distance is 8 miles that a candidate would have to travel to get to a testing center. However, in most of those cases, the test centers are located on campus or near campus, at least within the same community. Part of the initial program planning that Barbara mentioned would be for us to take a very close look at where the test centers are located in proximity to where your candidates are being prepared. And you could tell us up front before that 18 to 24-month clock starts ticking where you would like additional test sites to be located so that we could begin thinking about how do we prepare a particular facility to serve those candidates that are graduating in that particular population. We also offer, we would be able to offer the Tennessee licensure assessment program throughout the globe. So a number of different test sites across the country, across the globe, 1,600 test sites across the United States, and then a number of different test sites in neighboring states, some of which are right on the border of Tennessee, and I won't get into the specifics of that. One of the other goals that Dr. Wooten mentioned was the availability of data. And she talked about that in a number of different ways. And I'm going to highlight a tool that we make available to states, educator preparation programs that are using our assessments, and it's called Results Analyzer. So at the state level, and policymakers and researchers would be able to analyze individual candidate data, data that's coming in the aggregate from an individual program, or statewide data across any particular test, and then be able to further filter that test by the individual content areas that are covered within that test, and then apply different filters. And those different filters could be demographic filters, they could be by the institution, they could be a number of different ways that any policymaker or any researcher would want to take a look at that data, the performance data. Yes, sir.
Would an employer be able to look at that?
No.
Well, no, go ahead. All right, so a district's looking at candidates and they're trying to determine which ones are the best. They need a lot of, the more detail they have rather than what they score on the praxis and what was their GPA is basically what they're getting right now. Is there any way to get them more information?
The best way to use that information on not only the content licensure assessment, but I'm going to step back to the EdTPA as well, would be after the decision was made to employ the person, to take a look at the score profile and determine what type of guidance they may need in that first, second, or third year of teaching. So you wouldn't use this information to make the employment decision to determine that this candidate may or may not be better.
Why?
There would be other hopefully human resources filters that are in place. So you would have an in-person interview, you would have potentially a writing sample, you would have a portfolio that could be shared with the employer, that the principal or the committee at the school that's hiring the person would make that decision, and that these would really be more diagnostic tools that could be used to guide those first few years of professional development.
State perspective, this would give us some of that information that we would hope to have around first-time test takers, multiple attempts at the test in terms of pass rate. You know, it would help us understand at the program level what these candidates were experiencing in terms of the difficulty they had or didn't have passing the content assessment. Is that right?
That's correct. I don't have anything else, unless any of my colleagues had something to add before we entertain questions.
Just to mention that the test centers are secure, use fingerprinting, there's no possibility of someone taking a test for someone else.
You mentioned, I think in Massachusetts, there were 45 different subject area assessments. What's the example of those assessments?
That's an excellent question. So when we're referring to academic content areas, we're referring to perhaps secondary mathematics, perhaps elementary education, middle school science, agriculture, or any of the vocational fields that may need to be covered by a content licensure assessment. I don't know how many you currently use in the state, but I imagine it's close to that number.
So when you say secondary math, do you mean literally something as broad as secondary math, or do you mean algebra?
In the case that I'm sorry.
Secondary math, and it's if you decide if you want a 712 test, if you want a 912, it has to align with your certification requirements.
Again, we are giving endorsements to teach specific courses, and if someone like me wants to know not secondary math, which means they could hit a cut score down geometry and trig and whatever and not know jack about calculus, and yet they're endorsed to teach calculus. I want to avoid that. How do I avoid that?
Avoid that by creating what I'll call subtests. And what you do is, and what a lot of folks have done for elementary education, for example, but you could say you have an elementary subtest, algebra subtest, a geometry subtest, a statistics and probability subtest, whatever areas that you feel are the important ones to divvy these up in. And a person would have to take and pass each subtest in order to get a secondary math certificate and or an endorsement in a particular area. So you can set it, again, that's part of what your planning is. How do you set up your certificate and licensure areas and your endorsements, and we can modify or create separate subtests in order to meet those.
So Massachusetts and California do subtests?
Generally, they only do that at the elementary level or the early childhood level, but we have seen more breakouts at the secondary level. For example, a lot of states have what we call a composite science certificate, so you can teach anything, but then they also have biology, they have chemistry, they have physics. So it depends on how you could have a composite math certificate, and then you could have specialized math areas. Again, that's the nice part about customization.
I can give an example that's currently underway, the work that's currently underway in the state of Arizona. They had a situation that I imagine you may be experiencing here, where they wanted to maintain high standards on their secondary math content licensure assessment. So they didn't want to lower the bar any further than, they didn't want to lower the bar on the standard. So what they came to us to do was to ask if they were to develop an endorsement that would cover somebody who could teach mathematics from grades, say 7 through a particular content area at the secondary level. So I'm going to arbitrarily throw out geometry. Could we create a test that would allow someone to take that endorsement, which would limit the number of courses that the teacher was able to teach while still holding a standard high enough for those who were able to pass the general mathematics test to be able to teach those more advanced mathematics courses?
So how do you, this is going to come circle back around, how do you, I know the state would set the cut score, the state, but at the same time, you all would be providing instruction. There's a general math and there's a cut score. Why do we know that got cut, that was not, had no competency, that they're about to get an endorsement to teach without that subtest?
Well, you can look at scores by component. So it depends on, again, how you set the test up. So if you group all of the content of one area under one that we call sub area, you can look at scores by sub area. It is unusual for states to set cut scores by sub area, but that's another way for you to do that.
Well, but all right, so I don't think somebody needs to be a physics major in college to teach high school standards physics. But I do want to know that they know they're competent in high school standards. And there is going to be a pass-fail score. And the way things seem to run, they tend to be, if it was the student taking that class, they'd flunk it. We tend to, that's the part that so much of what we're sitting here about today is, how do we know as a citizen board that those people that we're saying go are ready to go?
Well, let me turn this around, because I told you before, you run the show. So you want a calculus test, tell us to run a calculus test. I mean, there's a point at which your experts in mathematics, your department heads, your statewide people, whatever, have a comfort level that the test is in fact strong enough and rigorous enough so that if someone is passing it and is going to be the one teaching calculus, that they in fact have that background. There's a lot of other ways to know whether they've had the background. I mean, hopefully they've taken courses at University of Tennessee or whatever. So I think I'm going to throw it back at you. If that's what you want to do, you're going to wind up driving yourself crazy, obviously, because you're going to have 542 tests, but that's fine too. I think you have to have a comfort level from a policy perspective. And there's a pilot process and so forth. I think you will find, I mean, what I always did, because you seem to be this way too, I ask people, how'd you like the test? Well, they say to me, well, I was a D student. I really struggled or whatever. There's sort of a common sense level here. And you get to I can remember in elementary, when we first started, our mathematics scores weren't moving at all. And yet they were all passing this test. We did an analysis and found out, these are my words, that you could compensate for a lack of knowledge in mathematics by doing well on the other components. And so these young people were passing the elementary test, but they were woeful in math. So we beefed up the math, my technical term, and it really made a huge difference. I had a young person say to me, well, what do you expect from me? I never took a math course since my junior year in high school. I said, what are you talking about? There's a requirement at the higher ed level that you take 2 math courses. Well, they took teaching math to the learning disabled and whatever else, which is a methods course. So they never really had mathematics. So I think there's a comfort level out there from your educators who know. This is a state that knows what it's doing. You've got a role. You've got a strategic plan. You've got a record of accomplishment. You rely on those people. And you will not develop, when you put your educators together with our people, you are not going to develop, in my judgment, a low-level math test. If anything, the teachers demand more. So I think there's a comfort level, but you're doing the right thing as a board member. Ask the question. So when it comes to this, whatever the cut score is, if you are in a situation where you only have a math test, secondary math, and that person who passes that test is therefore able to teach all the way up to calculus, you need to ask the question, how do we know that person can handle that?
So that's exactly what's happened. And I agree, we got the number one person in the country who's in a position to do exactly what we're doing on EPPs. But the reason y'all are sitting here talking to us and talking to us about content deal is because we and many other states have been endorsing math teachers based on 32 correct answers out of 60 for everything from 8th grade math up through calculus. So even as well as we are going to have to start thinking through with these higher standards, what kind of skills are we going to need in these classrooms? And when we go through this process, I want to make sure we get it right.
I think the one is a great process, super process, and you can't argue with that. And I think what we would like to have here is probably something like the 45 or 50 assessments that come out of a process like that. But when I get to thinking about what's involved in getting there, it's a massive undertaking. Now, Dave said he wouldn't have any that Pearson would bear the cost of this, but obviously somewhere there's a cost associated with that work.
Yeah.
Now, what is that, and where does that come back to? It's a massive effort. I mean, it kind of blows my mind when I start to think about what's involved in getting to that end result of something coming out of that process tied to Tennessee standards and having 45, 50 or something in that neighborhood. And that doesn't go as far as Mike would like to go, but it's still, that's a big process.
It is a massive process, but it's also enlightening and energizing, believe it or not. I mean, people like to be asked to contribute, and they do. And it's a lot of work. It's a tremendous amount of work. And
I agree. It's in fact, I like it a little bit to the standard setting process that we've been through. It's the same, again, a massive effort, but it's been very, ended up with good results, and we got the buy-in of all those educators that have been involved in that process. So it's been beneficial, but it's still a big process, scares me.
Well, and I would add that, when you really think about the ways that you increase student achievement, a primary way that you increase student achievement is that you have teachers who have more depth of content knowledge, and that depth of content knowledge really should start from their teacher preparation program. Obviously, they build on that throughout their first few years of teaching and beyond. So this is a lever that is a significant lever for us if we were going to say, where would we want to spend time, money, attention, ensuring that we have teachers with high levels of content knowledge and that our teacher prep institutions are aligning to those expectations would be a very important place to put our time, energy, and effort. I think to your point, though, capacity, time, money, those are all limited. And so you do have to pick and choose where you're going to put your highest priority, which goes back to, I think, Amy's slide earlier, where she noted, would you start with a certain set of assessments that were truly, aligned immediately to the work that we're doing and then add others? Or do you want to, spend a lot of time with all of the tests very early on? And to that end, then how do we want as a board and a department to really message this with our teacher prep institutions, because they'll have to come along with us with changes, because the assessment should ultimately point to changes that are made within the programs, and then how do we support that? So I think we're asking the right questions. I would just continue to emphasize that this is an important lever for us. It's how we package it and think about it and all the alignment that has to occur to make sure that we get the best end result from changing a content. Because it's really not just about changing a content test. It's the whole process that gets there. And then what do you do to backward map into your program to make sure that our teachers are actually getting what they need, and that assessment isn't just an exercise and an assessment, but it's changed what they really know coming out.
I kind of like the whole hog approach, but it just seems to me like that's too big a hog, and and I think there's some value too. Again, thinking back to the standard setting process that we went through, we didn't try to do English language arts, math, science, social studies, physical education, and everything else. We didn't try to do all that at one time. And I think there's, well, we've kind of got it in process now, but I think I could make a point that there's some value in getting some experience with this, not only from a capacity standpoint, but just you go learn some as you go through these, and use that learning experience to make the process better. So.
I was going to say the same thing. I mean, I do think we did a pretty aggressive approach to our core academic standards review. It was staggered and sequenced in some ways in terms of starting with math and language arts and then science and now social studies. But, maybe we think about the hog in terms of where we would want to customize, where we would want to explore the potentially off-the-shelf options that might suit our needs. I think, we could stagger our approach to how we eat the hog.
That's exactly.
Chairman Walton, this is Lil.
You'll come up with
I'm
an
in
idea for you.
one.
Oops.
Lillian. Okay. Lillian?
Yes, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I'm with everyone else, and I believe that the whole hog approach is ideal. However, I don't know what the expectations are for our next board meeting, since I'm not really officially a member of this subcommittee, and this is my first meeting with you all. But I'm thinking about this capacity challenge, and I think we talked about it earlier, and that the department, if they provide us with an understanding of the capacity challenges, what they know they can do, what that realistic timeline looks like, and yes, I think there's certainly a lot to be said about this phased-in approach. But what's the reality of the situation in terms of capacity? What's the reality with regard to the cost that the state would bear? Let's really understand this clearly so that when we meet in October, we can all ask appropriate questions at that time, because you'll have the full board. Because this is complex. It's not easy, and there's lots of pieces and parts, and the puzzle is huge, and it all has to fit together and make sense, and that we don't rush to judgment and do something There's another terminology I can't use because it's not appropriate, but half-baked, I'm going to say half-baked. You know, we have very talented, strong, smart people in the department, and we have great, talented teachers out in the field. And how many can we bring together at one time, and how many can Amy manage? So, you know, I'm just reiterating everything you all have said to say I want to see what the capacity challenges are, and what does the department believe is realistic. Does that make sense? Or does
Yes.
I think one of the things that we can do, and I don't know whether it would be appropriate for the next subcommittee meeting, but would be to put together a proposal, a plan that would say this could, and maybe even with options that would say, you know, and have some things, and we could talk with Pearson about cost and logistics and things, and have a little bit more detail around some options that we could use to approach this work.
Now, so one of the things, because of the absence of subspecialty tests, we really don't know what a teacher knows about a subject. A principal can get a really good sense that that teacher's very competent in that subject and see the results of those students on how well they're doing. But prior to that, over time, that's sort of earned. And during that period, we really don't know if they got a command of 50% of high school chemistry or 75%, or they're 100% competent. We don't know. I fully understand and I agree that we need to know what the cost is. We need to know what the capacity is, what our ability to. But when I look at our rules and our regulations, there's so many of them in there that are designed to accommodate school districts. And some of them are at the expense of those kids in that classroom. So as we talk through this thing, and as we look at how we spread this thing over, just remember that we really don't know right now the competency of those teachers in those classrooms who are teaching those subjects. We again, over time, we say, you know, that person knows Latin like crazy, but they don't know it for the first so many years. They just know they were endorsed in Latin.
Oh, go ahead,
Sarah?
Candace.
Well, let me also comment on this before we come back together as a group. I think it would be appropriate for us to also have a conversation with ETS as well as Pearson. Here's our goal, and let's see who can get us to our goal and present some options to you that are also thinking about the multitude of vendors that we have, because in particular ETS, you know, has been a partner with us on Praxis for years and years and years, and so we want you to see the options that we have with Pearson. And we have been impressed by looking at some of the work that they've done in other states, but we also know that these conversations need to also take place with ETS and to present options and goals to you at the next opportunity we have, if that's something you would like.
I think it definitely is, and I think that's kind of, I guess, where I'm coming to is kind of a summary of where we are, and basically that being that, you know, we see a strong need to move forward with Tennessee standard specific content tests or assessments, and then we've got the question about capacity of how quickly we can move with that, and what would be a recommendation coming from staff and from the department on how quickly we can do that. And I think we've got to, you know, look at all the options that are out there and determine how is the best way to get there. But you know, I think there's, you know, we've established, and at least in my mind, that the need is there. It's just a matter of the path to get there.
I would certainly agree, and I just want to put a pin in again something that Candace said earlier, because I think it's so important. I mean, there is urgency around this work for the very reason that you described in terms of as a lever for improving student achievement in our state. We have to start with our pipeline expectations, and we can't pretend that we have different expectations for content knowledge for our preparation providers than we do for our teachers in the classroom. I mean, we have just gone through an extensive process with our educators and our higher ed partners to raise our student standards in math, language arts, science, and now social studies. I think we would do ourselves a favor by starting probably within those content areas as we think about sort of the levers at the higher ed level. So I do think this sounds like a good path forward in terms of bringing back some proposals around our options with some urgency, and it sounds like we've got a good partner in Pearson potentially to think about and look at ETS as well. And I think, Chairman, to your sort of next steps, we'll have to think about the timing. Is it October? When should we try to bring that?
I think that it would be desirable for October. Now, is that doable for October?
I'm going to say yes. Amy's looking at me, but I would say yes. I mean,
Because that means September for us.
Yeah, I think that there are some decisions that obviously they're going to take some time, but if we can pull some things together, that's a proposal form, maybe even with additional questions that we're still needing to consider when we come together in October, at least you would know direction and where we are.
We're talking about just maybe a discussion at the workshop, not a policy.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking again, but
Okay.
looking to you.
But I would want to understand your expectation. Would this be a workshop item that we would bring to the next
Yeah,
board
that would be my expectation.
Okay.
And I think it's, highly desirable. It's such an important issue that we get it in front of the full board. And also, I think that the providers out there need to be informed that, the direction we're headed in too. As much lead time there is possibility, but I'm thinking a workshop item. Yeah.
That I think is
Okay.
I appreciate you guys coming. You may have equals out there, I don't know, but you're certainly the gold standard in the country. You're really making a whole lot of states functional, and I appreciate it, and we're honored that you came.
I can't help but make this statement. I've been watching states, and Race to the Top was a good example. Delaware, I talked to representatives in Delaware and Tennessee and said, if I close my eyes and open them 5 years from now, this is back, you better be challenging us because you made a lot of promises. The only state, in my judgment, that has emulated Massachusetts is Tennessee. I mean, there's been terrific work in California and New York, and you can name many, many other states. We know Kentucky and so forth. But this state, you've got it going, and it takes a lot. It takes the governor, it takes the legislature, it takes the department, it takes, it's very hard work. But you have, and probably you could point to 2 or 3 people that certainly your former governor was a key. I remember him talking to both candidates, the finalists at the next election, to make sure they kept it going. So you just got to keep it going. I smile when I hear this because you're going to come out fine, and you'll make us and ETS and others go through the right hoops because this is the right discussion, and you should have somebody who wants to go too far, and you should have someone else who says, "Wait a minute, geez, we only got," and that's the tension. But so many other states, I got to tell you, they just sit back and they say, well, what about this and what about that? Well, we don't have any money and we don't have the time. By the way, it doesn't cost any money for either vendor. But so I just have to compliment you. You've got it going, and just keep it going.
Dave, appreciate those comments, and I'll tell the rest of the folks here, that's what he's been telling me for the last 5 years. I'm going to believe it sooner or later. So. Yeah. Okay, Barbara, Nathan, appreciate you being with us. Good job. Appreciate it. Okay. Do we move forward to,
I think if we can,
comprehensive and interim reviews? And I don't know how sensitive we need to be to the 12:30.
I know some of us are getting on the road, you particularly, so we'll see what we can do in 45 minutes.
Sure.
Okay.
Happy. So, think you have seen this slide before. As you well know, we passed our new educator preparation policy in October 2014, and we've been working with the implementation working group over the course of the last 18 months to begin implementation of that policy. And it includes lots of different parts that you see here, and I'm going to focus on several of those today. First, I want to remind you that as a part of the new policy, we will have annual reports. And those annual reports are really going to be directed at our educator preparation providers. It will provide highly detailed, disaggregated data for them. They will be used regularly as a part of the comprehensive review that takes place every 7 years, but they are also going to be reviewed annually in order to determine whether or not there needs to be some sort of interim review that takes place before that comprehensive review. And I'll talk a little bit about both of those later today. And our goal will be to publish those annually on November 1st along with the report card. However, in this first year, we're planning to publish them this February. That will be our first annual report. So that's in contrast to the report cards that you're more familiar with, which the board is responsible for publishing. And we are, as you know, and you've heard Laura talk about, the board is leading a revision of the report card currently, and that report card now will be more directly focused on external stakeholders, making sure that they're able to easily interpret the information, and much more of that will be aggregated at the provider level to give people an indication of program health and quality. So I want to talk a little bit more today about the comprehensive reviews and what those entail. So the comprehensive review takes place once every 7 years, and that might seem like a long window, but as you've heard our faculty say today, you know, making changes in a program take a while, and then it takes time to get candidates through a changed program and into the classroom, and then for us to see results of those candidates. And that's part of the reason that there is this 7-year cycle. But the 7-year cycle begins well before that 7-year period. So the provider engages in what's called a self-study, and they present evidence to a review team prior to an on-site visit. So they address all of the standards and present their evidence. It's in an online format. Reviewers take a look at this well before, and that's what triggers that, what's called an off-site report, when it's a national study, and then allows the preparation provider to be prepared to address any areas that the review team might note as weaknesses or areas of concern. And then the on-site review takes place, and as you well know, we have two different pathways. You can go through national accreditation, or it can be a state approval team. That results in an on-site report, and that report identifies by standards whether or not the provider is meeting standards at both the initial and the advanced level. And then the provider has an opportunity to write a rejoinder to that. If they think that there was any evidence that wasn't considered that should have been, they could add that at that time. And then based on that, the department comes up with a recommendation that we then bring to you for board action. Review teams, site visitors are reviewers that come from multiple stakeholder groups. I'll say right now we're getting ready to initiate a recruitment of new reviewers now that we're going to be under CAPE. Everybody's got to get trained to be prepared. We have a set of reviewers in Tennessee that have taken it upon themselves to get trained, but now we will, at the state, we will conduct some trainings to get more of our folks trained. And we want to encourage districts and other education-related organizations to consider having their members become trained and participate in these reviews. That practitioner engagement in this work is critical. And here I've listed the CAPE expectations for site visitors, and we certainly embrace those for our state site visitors, that they are experts in this area, that they are analytical, that they strategically think about the work that they're doing and are able to analyze whether or not a provider is meeting expectations. And not only are they able to analyze it, but they're also able to convey that through their written reports. I think that's really important. if we believe these review cycles are going to actually be informative for our providers, they have to be able to take these reports and make them useful to improve their work. And then finally, of course, they need to be unbiased. We have lots of different types of providers in our state, and we want to embrace the diversity of our providers. And so a reviewer needs to leave their own personal expectations or beliefs behind them when they come on site for a visit. So review teams, everyone must be trained. I won't spend a long time on this since I know we're short on time. Happy to talk about that in more detail if you have questions. I will say that a national accreditation team is divided between folks who are coming from outside of Tennessee that come under CAPE. CAPE identifies who those folks would be and bring them to Tennessee. But we always have a few Tennessee representatives on an accreditation team. They look specifically at our program level requirements, but also support the overall accreditation process. When it is a state approval, all of the review team members are from Tennessee. That is something that we could consider whether we want to change, but it might be difficult to recruit people from other states, but we could talk about that. I wanted to just remind you of the CAPE standards that we've adopted. So these will be the standards that our providers will be assessed against. We do not have any reviews slated for this fall. Well, we have one focused review, but that was from a prior visit. But we have no comprehensive reviews slated for this fall. So our first comprehensive reviews under the CAPE standards will take place in the spring of 2017. And as you can see on these slides, and what we want to point out is that annual report data will factor in across each of the standards. And we think that's really important to demonstrate that not only are we looking at program design and implementation, but that we're also looking at outcomes and thinking about how program candidates are performing related to each of those standards and expectations.
Number 3, part of what we discussed earlier would be adding diversity in recruitment.
So I'm glad you brought that up. That's that's something the implementation working group has been working on a lot, and we are and we're writing our report for you right now that we will bring in October. And we've been talking about how providers will write recruitment goals in partnership with the districts that they work with, and as a part of that, expectations related to diversity, high need area subject areas, and I think there might be one other one I'm not thinking about right now. But in addition to that, we're also talking about writing statewide goals in terms of increasing diversity that the department would have, and increasing the numbers of our candidates across the board who are completing preparation, who are diversifying our educator workforce. So very much something that's been an important part of the conversation. I'll also say that that's been an important part of the conversation. We've been rewriting our literacy standards, which we'll bring to you in October as well, and diversity has been a significant part of that conversation as well.
Once we decide to do that, then we need to help really think through how they're going to do it. And I'm convinced we can do it. I'm convinced that we can start at early age in high school, recruit kids, get scholarships, get endowments and stuff, and I think we can do it, but it's going to require us having to work. It's a work
It
program.
is. We think there are a lot of untapped resources that are ready for us to do this work. You know, Tennessee Promise has really set the stage to allow more of our students to enter college and have it paid for the first 2 years. And there are existing scholarships for minority candidates who want to become educators. And I think that what we are thinking about doing is how do we set up those pipelines and make sure that students and school systems are very aware that they exist, and even thinking about high school academies that can be focused on preparing teachers. We've been working with our college and career ready folks on thinking more about development in those areas. Again, these are the other two standards. Standard 4, program impact, I think is going to be a significant change for our providers. This is where we will report all of that outcome and impact data that will inform the annual reports and roll up into our report cards. So I think that the question at hand is, how will the results of the comprehensive reviews and the annual reports factor into our decision making about providers' approval status? And so currently, we do have that outlined in our policy that exists now. And I won't go over each one of them, but if a provider is below expectations on one standard, they would have to, at minimum, have probationary approval with major stipulations.
That's what's currently.
We haven't started implementing this.
Well, no,
Yeah.
well, the outcomes are current.
Yes.
The outcomes are current, whether you're under CAPE standards or in CAPE standards. This represents what
Draft.
the CAPE standards.
Right.
Right. So this is just an example of what could happen. And when a provider doesn't meet a standard, at minimum, they would have probationary approval with major stipulations. And that would mean they would not be able to enroll more candidates until they had addressed the deficiency.
Anyone. So
Right.
this is
It
not
doesn't
where,
differentiate
this is
across
not
the
where
standards.
we're talking about priority standards and.
No, and we could.
No,
But we're
whatever.
not.
But don't want, yeah. So if they hit below expectations on any one of those fives, that's a big deal.
Big deal. Those 5 standards are important standards. And I think that while we might place emphasis on standard 4 because it does look at outcomes and impact, I don't think we want to undervalue standard 1, which is knowledge, skills, and disposition. That's that foundation. That's what does your program design look like, and how do you know that? And standard 2 is assessment of candidates. How do you know that your candidates are in fact adequately prepared? So all of these standards, in our view, are important.
Bill killers.
So I want to talk a little bit about interim reviews. This is a change under this policy. Prior to this policy, we didn't have any mechanism that allowed us to take an action in that 7-year window, but now we will. And interim reviews are based on the data from the annual reports. So I want to, here on the left column, leftmost column, you'll see the set of components that will comprise the annual reports. And I do want to note that in the first annual report, we won't have data on all of these because we are in the process of developing our satisfaction surveys, for example. And so we've got to roll those out. And until we do that, we won't have data in all of these areas. But decisions that we have to make are what triggers an interim review. And that is not in the policy. That's not explicitly in the policy at this moment. And so you could imagine that a provider would have an annual report where they would fall below expectations on placement, but they would be above expectations on completer outcomes and impact. And here, I think, is what you were thinking about, Mike, is would we want to place priority on any of the components over others? And are there some of the components, such as placement, where a provider might say, well, we know that 50% of our candidates were placed in a state other than Tennessee, and that's why our placement is lower, not because our candidates couldn't find jobs. And so a lower placement rate may be indicative of different things. In one case, placement in other states, and in another case, challenge finding employment.
There ought to be a percentage of employer satisfaction that triggers a serious.
And I think that in order to know what that percentage is, it'll be important to pilot the new survey, see what the results look like, analyze the data, bring that back to you, perhaps with recommendations of of what those thresholds would look like. That's part of the work that Laura's group has been doing with the Report Card Advisory Council in thinking about some of the areas where we do have data. And we want to try to stay aligned on the annual report and the report card to the greatest extent possible. And I will remind you that here I'm showing you annual report as if it's one measure. The annual report will also hopefully be disaggregated across programs within a provider when they're high enough ends. So we'll also have to make decisions about, is there an interim review when we just see a problem in secondary math and everything else looks good? So I'm not sure, and Martin always says this to me, it's not simple math. And so sometimes there are going to be, judgment calls that we have to make about when it's time to actually, conduct that interim review. There could be some places where we say absolute, no matter what, if we see this, we have an interim review, but we might want to leave ourselves flexibility in other cases.
What all's included in retention? What does that mean?
We have an explicit metric. I'm looking at Michael back there, and that's a part of that report that we're gonna bring. I can't quote the metric off the top of my head right now, but it is basically, of those candidates who were ever placed, how many of them remain in our schools, and there's some consideration for how long they remain.
So we're talking about millennials who move around more than gypsies, and so they could be in teaching and be off doing something else, but not really reflect how good a teacher they are. They could move to Kathmandu. There's all sorts of reasons why they get married, and all sorts of. It seems to me the only one that would be instructive to us in retention would be non-renewals. I may be wrong, I may be missing something, but
I mean, these are the exact conversations that
Absolutely.
we're having,
Yeah.
and you
Absolutely.
identified earlier, what's the importance you place on an employer satisfaction, or let's say completer outcomes or completer impact, compared to what you would place on retention. Well, they're different, right? I mean, you would put different weights on those. You would have different thresholds for thinking about it. You'd have to use some judgment, because it isn't simple math, on how you're going to rate these, or how you're going to trigger some kind of a review. But these are the exact conversations that are being had. Laura, you want to?
could we not require districts to provide us non-renewal?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that question, but I get a little bit concerned because I don't know that we can tell when a non-renewal is based on performance versus when non-renewal is based on decline in student enrollment or a change in strategy related to
So
staffing patterns.
We ask them, non-renewals based on performance.
But I'm not sure you get good answers when you ask that question. It's
Well, they're
depending on exit interviews.
They're taking action at school boards. It's public. I mean, if you want to watch 146 school boards.
I think too that this is an ongoing process, and this is my team has been talking about that this is a work in progress that will be refined over time. And I think this goes back to something you mentioned earlier about, if we think about the requirements for advancement, if we put in important measures that someone has to demonstrate in order to advance, then we could ask the question, how many of our candidates who were eligible for advancement, meaning they were there for 3 years, met the bars for advancement? That would be the interesting question. But at the moment we don't have that.
I think you're on that. You're on.
But I think we're moving in that direction. So I think again, and this is going to be a living, breathing type of work that we refine over time. So this was just a draft example of how we could do this if we were trying to make it, trying to put some parameters around it. So we could say that an interim review would automatically be triggered when 3 or more metrics in one annual report were below expectations. Any prioritized metric, so if we wanted to say that employer satisfaction was a prioritized metric, that could automatically trigger an interim review, or any metric in 3 consecutive annual reports, perhaps. And those are the types of definitions that we could attach to interim reviews if we chose to do so. I think it'll be important. And I would say that we might want to take a look at our first annual reports and see what they look like, and then start to make some of those decisions as we move down the line.
Thing that I guess I get back to your comment, Martin's comment about it isn't simple math. I think it's really hard to develop real strong specifications around this, because I think it's a lot of judgment involved in these things, looking at the total report and so forth. So I get that apprehensive.
I think
No, it
Amy's
has
made a
to
good
be
point.
defendable, though. It has to
Well,
have
yeah,
enough.
that's the
structure.
balance you have to wrestle with.
That's right.
Yeah.
Just the process of interim reviews as we begin to think about how we would conduct these. After the annual reports are finalized, the department would bring the results of those annual reports to the board, and any parameters that we had set that would automatically trigger reviews, we would bring those and present those to you. And following that, we would communicate directly with the educator preparation providers about the action that's required. In some cases, it might just be that they need to write a report. In other cases, it might be that we need an on-site visit. I think that that's another area where we want to be careful about what parameters we set about what's required. And then the provider would need to respond to that action.
Amy, I'm looking back at this document too. So basically what we're saying is that we'll have annualized reports finalized early next calendar year, and then it'd be probably the April board meeting where you'd be presenting some of these sort of potential ways that the data would trigger interim reviews.
And I think it comes back again to this idea we were talking about with EdTPA and no consequences. I think this first time out of the gate with the annual reports being produced this year, we're going to have limited data in them because our historical data doesn't always fit neatly into these annual reports. And so we might not want to make them highly consequential this February. I'm not saying we couldn't use them because we have the policy in place, but I think we want to be very, very thoughtful about using 1 year of data, or in some cases 2 years of data, to trigger an interim review with new metrics. So this February gives us an opportunity to take a look at what these annual reports will look like moving forward, and then we will have those produced again next fall. And I think that we'll all have a lot more familiarity and comfort level with those annual reports by that time. But I think we will certainly bring a report on the annual reports.
And one of
this
the,
spring.
the positives about that transition is that we would have data where you could do some straw man on, if you set this at certain thresholds or looked at it this way, what would the result be? And that's something that we can then talk about, obviously internal to the department, but with the state board as well. So it'll allow
That's kind
us
of what
a
I was
lot
thinking.
more
Like next
opportunity.
spring, we should be able to have a more anchored conversation potentially in some of those straw man kind of examples around real data reports that we're starting to see.
Right.
So how do we get some of these colleges, universities are going to see this and immediately go, all right, it's a new ball game. These interim reports could really bite us, and others could look at them and yawn and say perfunctory, or it not go all the way up the chain to the person who's really looking at the economics of the college and the university and saying, dang, this is more. How do we get this in the minds of the 40 plus providers that pay attention, folks, because this.
Well, so let me attempt to address that. When we were sharing in the document that, Sarah, I think you were referencing earlier, we did map out that in February, our goal is in February, maybe early March, where we would have some type of an event that the governor and state board and the department and higher education would jointly convene. And at that event, we would be putting forth a report that our department is working on that's generally on sort of the state of teacher prep. SCORE has a report out, and we would work together on some type of an event that would bring together the provost, vice presidents, presidents, obviously, in a conversation around this. And like we have done with our the infamous Common Core event that we had. Y'all will probably remember that, where we had multiple presentations that were part of it. We've done the same thing with some of the Drive to 55 and Tennessee Promise work. It would be something like that, focused on educator preparation. The report results, which are also going to talk about supply and demand, and a variety of the quality issues, would be at the center of that. But this would also be an opportunity for us to do some brief presentations on some of these topics, so your higher ed administrative staff would actually have the information firsthand from us, as well as some briefs and some communication before and after that. So that was the goal.
Yeah.
I'd get it, hopefully.
So these are just considerations that, and I think we've talked about all of these already, about how we will set priorities for each of these components of the review processes and implement them as we move forward.
Okay.
Happy to have
Questions? I guess one question I've got is, with the one of the last CAPE assessments that we had, obviously wasn't too pleased with the results. Are they geared up to really do assessments, or are we getting caught right now with them not being fully there, or where is CAPE with doing assessments?
So one note is that we haven't had any reviews completed under the CAPE standards. Everything that we've brought thus far was under NCAPE Legacy. And my understanding, and we've talked with CAPE staff, is that and I let me say too that in terms of what you're referencing, I think that the findings of the review teams have not been where we've had some challenges with CAPE, but rather with the decision making subsequent to those findings. And it's my understanding that under the new CAPE standards, that any provider that is going through initial accreditation processes that does not meet all standards will not be accredited. That's what we've been told, and that's what we understand is in the handbook, I believe is where it's located. I'm looking at Martin. So we are still cautiously optimistic about moving forward under CAPE. We do think the standards are strong. We think we are developing a lot of tools and procedures that CAPE has told us they are willing to accept. So anytime Tennessee has a standard that's higher than a CAPE standard, they will accept that. Anytime we have a required tool in our state, they will accept that as a part of the process. So I think we're taking them, at their word on that, and at this point, continuing to move forward.
They're sort of in a ramp-up situation anyway, aren't they? If you ever get any sense they're not committed to it, you ought to hit the alarm button. But
Well, I'm a new board member for CAPE.
Uh-oh.
So brand new. So I'll let you know.
Okay. Well, I read that whole deal on CAPE, and they're awesome. I mean, I think if they go do what they say they're going to do, you all do it. Man, it's a big deal.
We're on the, I guess when we were early on in the presentation, we were talking about the results of the annual, not the annual review, the review process. And if you don't meet one of the standards, your major stipulations, and you cannot enroll new students. Are we all comfortable with that? Where are we with that? Is that what is in place right now, or that is under consideration, or
It's in the policy. So the policy provides some flexibility. So the policy, and Michael, I don't know if you can pull it up. I figured you had it up because I don't have it in front of me. But if I'm not mistaken, it says one or if a provider does not meet one or more standards, the possible actions that the board can take are probationary approval with major stipulations or denial of approval. More than one standard, okay. But if it is one or
One,
more,
you go to the probationary approval with major stipulations, which entails no new candidates.
So it'd be like 1 year to cure it, otherwise.
well, now that's a interesting question. So the probationary approval does not, it provides the timeline related to the probationary approval is about the plan that they submit to the department to address the deficiency.
But you guys aren't gonna look at something in some biblical time frame plan.
I believe it's
and-
90 days that they have to submit the plan.
But the plan actually curing, to implement that cures the problem can't be some.
Well, again, I would say that this is where it gets complex, because if it is that they are falling down on outcomes related to candidate performance and they make changes to their programs, how long does it take for us to see that result in the field? Or for us to have data to be confident. And so I'm not sure that there's a one size fits all for that, but maybe that's a part of the plan is when we would expect to see the data.
Let me ask a question on that. Are you saying that they come with a plan on performance in the field that in order to see it, it has to start with their entry level students? Or would that go and say, hey, we have to go back and retool the senior class because we're about to put them out in the market in which they're not prepared?
I might let the commissioner respond to this, but I think that our authority to enforce curricular changes only goes so far. And in terms of what universities how they can change requirements of existing candidates is not something that we can necessarily enforce.
Candidates come in under certain catalog years, and so there are requirements in those catalog years, which is why it's important to have this pre-information to them. And then the candidates come into teacher preparation under that particular catalog years, and those are the admission requirements. Unless there's something significant that changes, there can be a notification if there's enough time before that student graduates for that notification. So you would have to be very sensitive to that. So it wouldn't be backward mapping, it would be about what happens going forward.
Well, if I were in a catalog group that people knew was not producing very good results upon graduation, I'd want to know it. I'd say, hey, you're about to push me out in the market, and I'm not skilled up based on my successors, success. There ought to be something going on that happens really immediately that says, hey.
There are some universities here in Tennessee. I can think of two. I don't know if either of them are continuing to do this, but they're both private institutions. They did something called a guaranteed diploma, right? It was a guarantee. So if you got out into the field, let's say you were struggling with classroom management, whatever it may be, then you were able to come back and audit a course essentially to get additional information. So that is occurring at universities, I believe, still now with both of these two institutions. So there is precedent at some level for that to occur. And there is also precedent if you felt like you needed additional mentoring in your first couple years. There are institutions that are also providing that.
I also think that the report cards themselves are going to put pressure on institutions to make changes more quickly. So I don't know that we have to expect all of the pressure to come through this process. I'm not disagreeing with you about urgency, but
So, that I keep thinking about this report card as a great consumer guide for incoming freshmen to pick a department. But you just said something that it is equally as important to get in the hands of people that are in the program. They are in a position to really bring pressure on that program.
And that was one of the things, and again, I would say Laura and our team collaborated on this, but she really led a group of, we did a bunch of focus groups, and we did talk with candidates, current candidates, about their awareness about the report card. And so that is something that we are very interested in, and hope that we can increase, that this is a part of what you look at when you are in your preparation program, and you're thinking about it, asking your provider questions if there are areas that you have questions about.
Well, and certainly the candidate who's currently in the program or the alum who feels challenged, that's your very best lever for change, because they've got this vested interest. They've paid to go to that university, and for them to come back and say, I wasn't prepared, or for that to be, on your employer surveys too. I mean, that's another great lever. Then that's going to get the attention of the people at the program. I mean, when I would talk to a candidate and they said, I really didn't understand X, that was the best moment for change, because I heard it directly from someone, and I knew that that person needed our help. They were out in the field and they didn't get what they needed. And so those kinds of conversations you hope will occur more often. They happen now. They absolutely happen now. This may be a more a formalized way for it to occur when you have the data in front of you too.
What else do we need to do on the comprehensive interim reviews to kind of bring this to discussion to closure today?
Not from my standpoint. I think in this case, we were really wanting to use this time just to make sure that our subcommittee really was aware of sort of the work that's happening, to bring further recommendations around how, like Amy was describing, some of these things will start to come together once we have annual reports. But that's why this was last on the agenda, not because it's not as important, but the timeliness in terms of a decision. We're not yet to a place where we need to make any consideration decisions.
Okay. Anything else on item? Okay, one thing I just looked in some of my notes here that we did not talk about, I don't think, when we were talking about the implementation of EdTPA, and that was, we had a little bit of discussion about it yesterday, was looking at some way that we can incent early adoption of this, and I think that ought to be included in what we come back with, is any ideas that we've got that we can incent institute. Maybe
That's a timely discussion.
The one thing I wanted to just check on, and that'd be the next meeting for this group, this committee. And I was talking to Sarah yesterday. I'm thinking that we would probably plan to schedule it. We'll get Phyllis obviously to work on that, but in the November time frame or after the October meeting. And I guess the question is there a need for this group to get back together prior to that, or prior to the October meeting?
So if we're gonna vote on anything in October and it needs to have the committee with the recommendation, we talked about a few of those things. I don't know.
Yeah, what I was thinking about there is that we would basically summarize our discussion here, get staff to summarize that discussion, come back to this committee with an email to
Got it.
to get the recommendation, but not have an actual meeting. Is what we're thinking, but not have another physical meeting of the committee until after the October meeting, probably in November.
I want to clarify, because there's a document in the folder that has this timeline of decision points. It was very helpful. So in the performance assessment requirement, I want to make sure I understand what we would be deciding on in October, because it is noted as a decision date.
Yes, so in my notes from today's meeting, I mean, we've passed on first reading the requirement for EdTPA at the July meeting for all candidates beginning in January 2019. I think we need to put some additional detail to that requirement for the October final reading. And again, as you were just noting, Chairman, if there's sort of consensus from the subcommittee around sort of those three buckets that we outlined, we'll go back to our notes, but in terms of the elementary requirement, again, what 2019 expectations would be for implementation and any cost considerations. If there's a need for the subcommittee to hop on the phone and have another call before we would bring something in October around those three areas specifically, we could do that. But what I'm imagining is that the October final reading on that item would include those three specifications based on feedback that we could get via email. Does that sound right? Okay.
Okay. Anything else? Any other questions we've got out there or lingering things we need to address today?
Only other thing that is on my mind that we'll collaborate about is exactly, what and how we want to cover in the October workshop, all of the various things that relate to teacher prep. I'm already thinking we may want to kind of do a deep dive with our full board. It may mean that we have to sort of prioritize that over some other things that might have been on the agenda for the workshop. So we just need to think about that and put our heads together. Chairman, I'll be checking with you, and obviously department staff will be thinking. But sounds like, at least my mental list is there's a number of things on teacher prep.
And one of the questions, I guess, with the work that we're doing on the report card, is that all coming together? We've got the data we need, and that's all coming? I think it's a terribly important piece of this whole process.
It is coming together quite rapidly at this point. So we're in crunch mode for the next couple of weeks, Spencer and I, along with Amy's team as well, trying to wrap up a few decisions. And so one of the things that Sarah and I have discussed is providing to the full board an update via email about kind of where we are in our progress. And perhaps, I think if we have a week or two out, we can probably share some design samples of what we think it will look like here pretty soon. But yes, things are progressing, and we're just waiting on the last few pieces of data before we kind of send that off into the design phase.
That's one of the things I'm thinking about for the October workshop that we had talked about in person, having a fuller discussion about the report card that'll come out November 1st.
Bill, anything from your end that we need to address?
No, I think it's been a very helpful session. I'm grateful. I will be eager to think with the staff about the report card architecture and anything that could be sent in the formative stages to us that's appropriate. I think that's going to really be a powerful instrument for us in terms of improvement.
Great. Okay. Lillian, anything from your end?
Nothing. Thank you for asking, Chairman Ralston. No, thank you.
Well, Bill and Lillian certainly appreciate being with us today, and appreciate everybody's involvement in this meeting. I think a very productive meeting as far as I'm concerned. Learned a lot at each one of these, and I think we're making good progress. And as I said earlier, I don't think we've got a lot of important subjects out there we're dealing with, but I don't think none are any more important than this. So appreciate everybody's involvement. Okay.
Well done, Chairman. It's 12:30 on the nose.
Hey.
You know how to run a meeting.